Passion Pages. Chapter 190. Su Li's face was pale, and his body was trembling. In the eyes of the military police captain, this scene was naturally a sign of fear. The military police captain had a phone call with his superiors earlier, and he also lived in the research institute on a regular basis. Naturally, he knew why this young second lieutenant ran to Professor Shen's lab and smashed it. He looked at Su Lu with a trace of pity, thinking that this young second lieutenant was quite brave. Facing the pressure of the technical director of the board of directors, he actually dared to not hand over the lab, and even raised an axe to smash the data rack. This kind of fierceness made the military officer, who knew the inside story, admire him. Admiration was only a feeling deep in his heart. After receiving the order from his superiors, the military police captain knew that this person had gotten into big trouble. For a moment, he still didn't know how this person passed the 3 scans and sneaked into the lab, but he only knew that what awaited Su Lu would be a merciless military court trial. Destroying the core confidential data of the Federation, what kind of crime was this? Fortunately, the central control computer of the Research Institute's 3rd department had already confirmed that the core data of Professor Shen's lab had been electronically protected. The moment it was destroyed, it was successfully transferred to Area B. If that data was destroyed, he would probably be sentenced. The military police captain felt a chill in his heart. At this time, looking at the cold sweat-drenched and silent Su Lu, he didn't have the slightest sympathy. Instead, it added a bit of coldness. At the entrance of the 1st Military Academy, Su Lu was escorted to a military vehicle by fully armed military police. The military vehicle drove along the quiet and dark road of the capital special district into the distance, silent all the way. After getting on the military vehicle, Su Li's ankles were also tied with a high-strength plastic rope. The military police had obviously received orders from their superiors to lock him up as a serious criminal. The military vehicle was very quiet along the way, and Su Lu was also silent. He was a smart person, completely opposite to his honest and ordinary appearance. His intelligence surpassed most people in the Federation, otherwise Feng Yu wouldn't have chosen him back then. Therefore, he clearly knew what kind of terrifying power the existence that had invaded his brain at the other end of the Black Dream possessed. Furthermore, he deduced an extremely terrifying conclusion from the other party's ability. If the thing that had helped him transfer and modify the laboratory data was really the existence that he had guessed, it would be too unbelievable. It was so unbelievable that he didn't want to believe his own theory, even if it was the only possibility. Perhaps it was because of the worry and fear in his heart, or perhaps it was because of the extreme hunger in his stomach. Su Li's lips didn't have any color of blood. They were dry and white. He stuck out his tongue and licked his lips slightly. Suddenly, he said to the silent military police in the military vehicle, "Brothers, do you want to smoke a whole cigarette?" The gendarme sitting next to him was stunned. He didn't expect that this guy, who had just gotten out of his daze, would want to smoke without a trace of fear. Did he not know that he had committed a serious crime? The military policeman subconsciously glanced at the captain, who was sitting in front of him with his eyes closed. The captain was resting with his eyes closed. Hearing Su Li's words, the captain opened his eyes and nodded. Su Lu raised his hands, accepted the lit cigarette and said thank you. His hands were tightly tied together. It was a bit difficult to bring the cigarette to his lips. He greedily took a deep drag of the cigarette. Passion Pages. The filter of the cigarette was still between his lips. He immediately took a second drag. Smoke filled the military vehicle. The gendarme sitting next to him and across from him gave him a strange look. They thought that this second lieutenant probably knew that he could be shot, so he treated this cigarette as the last one to smoke. The slightly dry and strong smoke poured into Su Li's lungs. It could calm the mind and satisfy one's spiritual needs. Only now did Su Li's complexion gradually improve. Destroying the Federation's confidential data was equivalent to treason. Not to mention, he had killed an active Federation officer on Tiger Mountain Road in the middle of the night. However, Su Lu wasn't thinking about these things at all. His hands and feet were bound by high-strength plastic rope. This special high-strength plastic had long replaced metal handcuffs and was used in large quantities by the federal military and police. For the Federation government, this high-strength plastic was enough to bind all normal humans to death. However, no one would have thought that in the countless galaxies of the Federation, there would always be a few abnormal humans. Back in the Donglin district, Sulu had once used his own strength to break this high-strength plastic rope. He believed that he wasn't the only abnormal human in the Federation. Uncle Feng Yu was one, and presumably, that old man in the lees of Philadelphia was also one. However, Sulu didn't have the thought of breaking the plastic rope, suddenly killing people, flipping the car, escaping prison, and becoming a fugitive from the Federation again. Black dreams, active connections, characters, countless blueprints, and green data streams like a waterfall. Sulu stared at the flame of the cigarette in front of him and took a deep breath. Previously, he had already moved the pictures in his mind and confirmed that the core data and formulas in Professor Shen's laboratory had all been transferred to his mind by that existence. How did a huge amount of data transfer into his brain so quickly? Was it through the ubiquitous electronic monitoring network of the Federation? Could he still be considered a normal human right now? Sulu closed his eyes tightly, and the cigarette between his dry lips gradually shortened. He kept trembling slightly, and the ash fell on his knees, and was blown to the floor by the wind. After escaping from the Donglin district, he specifically studied the 740,000 words of the First Charter because that was the existence he was most afraid of. The glory of the First Charter shone on the Federation, but under the First Charter, only one-way data flows could ever be carried out. The five-person group's regulations were to cut off all the ways that the central computer affected the chips in the human body due to logic chaos. Why could he accept the data in reverse? That existence had entered the data twice, which was equivalent to invading the human brain. This was a serious violation of the highest rules of the First Charter. Why would this kind of logic error appear in that cold computer program? Active connections, accept? Sulu thought of the light talisman that had appeared many times in the hospital and in the laboratory. He couldn't help but close his eyes and think, I chose to accept before, so that existence actively invaded my brain. He couldn't understand, so he stopped thinking. Sulu slowly opened his eyes. The fear, confusion from before had long disappeared. He didn't need to care about that black dream, didn't need to care about what was wrong with that cold central computer, didn't need to care about whether the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation was weaving some kind of conspiracy. He wasn't even afraid of death, so what was there to be afraid of? At this moment, he only knew that in the battle for data in the laboratory, he had inexplicably gained an overall advantage. The initiative to develop the new generation mecha of the Federation had once again returned to his hands, or perhaps it should be said that it had returned to his mind. Tonight, he had single-handedly defeated the Federal Academy of Science, defeated the Iron Schemer, and defeated Macklin. That was enough. He should say thank you, right? The cigarette had burned to the end, and the burnt smell of the filter sponge was very pungent. Sulu used his tongue to wet his lower lip, and only then did the dry stick of the cigarette fall off the dry skin on his lips and fall to the ground. He moved his bound feet with some difficulty and stepped on the cigarette to extinguish it. Then, he took a deep breath, narrowed his eyes, and looked at the military prison gate of the Department of Defense that was getting closer and closer. The prison gate was brightly lit. The Federation soldiers who had already received the order frowned and looked at the prisoner being escorted out of the car. They didn't know what crime this soldier had committed to be escorted to the prison for serious criminals. Sulu was escorted out of the military vehicle. Looking at the Federation soldiers around him who were on guard, he moved slowly with great difficulty. His eyes narrowed, and through those blinding searchlights, he looked at the gradually setting moon in the night sky. He thought of Professor Shen in the cemetery under the moon and smiled happily. The capital spaceport. The two moons that were slowly moving in the night sky occupied two remote corners of the field of vision. The silver moonlight was completely suppressed by the lights in the spaceport. A streamlined spaceship quietly docked in the light, and a few middle-aged officials gathered below the spaceship. The highly respected Dean Lin of the Federal Academy of Science finally finished the Warship Space Portal test on the Moon base and returned to Planet S1 accompanied by several government officials. Dean Lin walked in the front. His hair was white. 11 days of continuous low-gravity environment made the old man's body a little uncomfortable, and his face was slightly gloomy. His position in the Federation was extraordinary and noble. No matter how the president was replaced, he had already been in the position of the Dean of the Federal Academy of Science for 17 years. Even if he had been in the toilet for 17 years, he could still make the toilet his own, not to mention the Federal Academy of Science. Secretary Luo, who followed behind, knew that Dean Lin's expression was not because of the trip to the moon. He silently dragged behind the team, but the corner of his eye was paying attention to the blue light of the communicator in his jacket pocket. The phone rang. Secretary Luo slowed down his footsteps and walked further away from the crowd before answering the call. Data confirmed safe. A sincere smile appeared on Secretary Luo's face. After hanging up the phone, he sped up and walked to the front of the team. When he walked to the front of the old man, he nodded imperceptibly. The officials accompanying Dean Lin found that the old man seemed to have adapted to the change in gravity. His face was much better, and they were immediately relieved. In a small room next to the top floor of the Capital Sanlin United Bank building, Secretary Lu put down the phone, walked to the president's office, whispered a few words, and was ready to go home. Li Xiuzhu, who was sitting on the chair, shook his head. Although he was very satisfied with this result, he really didn't expect that the young second lieutenant named Su Lu would actually be so valiant, to the point of crazily raising an axe and charging into the laboratory. Fortunately, the data was connected to the central database. Li Xiuzhu's extremely handsome face showed a trace of tiredness. When he thought about the silence of the old man from the Federal Academy of Science, his tiredness turned into a sarcastic smile. Then he called his father and informed him of this matter. Then he dialed another number. Li Xiuzhu really admired the councilman on the other end of the phone because he had never seen anyone who was more like a natural politician than that person. He was able to connect the interests of various parties through an insignificant matter. This should be a natural ability, and Li Xiuzhu admitted that he couldn't do it. Senator Medellin, congratulations. In an ordinary apartment in the capital, Senator Medellin's secretary, Helen, rushed into the bedroom with a trace of lust in her eyes. Tonight, the senator stayed in the office, so her date with him was delayed until late at night. Fortunately, Senator Medellin let her go, or else she was worried that he would leave in anger. What makes you so happy? There was a box of Noble 37 brand cigarettes on the bedside. The man slightly narrowed his eyes and looked at Helen. His handsome face, lazy expression, and peach blossom eyes were really fascinating. At least, he fascinated Helen, an old virgin with an ordinary face, to death. Helen giggled and directly pounced on him. She said seductively, "If you can make me unable to sleep tonight, I will tell you." For many people, this must be a sleepless night. Chapter 191. In the wee hours of the morning, the snow-white bedding on the big bed in the apartment was very messy, and the air was filled with the faint smell of chestnut flowers. A woman in her 30s was sitting in front of the bed, looking at the mirror on the dressing table. She squinted her eyes and smeared the lipstick on her lips. Her eyes were full of laziness after lust. She was only wearing a small lace underwear. Her smooth back, enchanting curves, and full buttocks were especially alluring because of the way she was sitting. Shi Qinghai lit a cigarette and looked at Helen's smile in the mirror. Other than him, not many people knew that the confidential secretary in Senator Macklin's office hid such a mature and seductive body under the gray formal dress. After taking off her glasses, the secretary released the lust that she had been suppressing for many years. There was a sense of infatuation in her bones. Helen's face in the mirror looked a little tired, but it was the kind of tired that was satisfied. On her dignified face, only the small wrinkles in between her eyebrows revealed her true age and her usual strict and reserved side. "Darling, I'm going to take a shower." Helen had to rush to Parliament Hill at 8 o'clock. Her work was much busier than the average person's. After the madness last night, she only had time to sleep for 2 hours before she had to leave again. She turned her head and looked charmingly at Shi Qinghai, who was smoking at the head of the bed. She smiled, put on a bathrobe, and walked into the bathroom. After closing the bathroom door, the warm water sprinkled down. Helen stood under the water, holding her face that was still a little hot. She raised her head and let the hot water wash over her naked and sensitive body. Her thoughts had already moved away from the pleasure that the man brought her to other places. Her eyes revealed a trace of reluctance, doubt, and self-comfort. She knew that she was not attractive when she was a secretary, especially when she had an ordinary face. Why did the man outside who fascinated her take a fancy to her, a woman who was already over 30 years old? As Senator Macklin's secretary, she had the needs of a normal person. She was also obsessed with the strange impact that the fancy man brought. Even so, she remained calm. She had already observed for a month, and she would continue to observe. If it was as she expected, she had no choice but to apologize to that man. Hearing the sound of running water coming from the bathroom, Shi Qinghai suddenly opened his eyes. His eyes, which were full of infinite attraction, moved to the phone quietly placed on the dressing table. Shi Qinghai gently placed the half-burnt cigarette on the ashtray and quietly walked to the dressing table. He looked at the phone that reflected a metallic luster on the wooden table. He keenly noticed that there were 2 extremely thin strands of hair in the black keyboard area below the phone. 2 extremely thin strands of black hair gently rested on the black keyboard area. If one didn't pay special attention, they definitely wouldn't notice it. Moreover, the placement of these 2 strands of black hair was also very particular. Shi Qinghai glanced at the closed bathroom door and smiled. He carefully moved the 2 strands of hair away and opened the back cover of his cell phone. Perhaps because she was in a hurry to get to Parliament Hill, Secretary Helen's shower time was much shorter than the last few times she had sex with Shi Qinghai. She wrapped her hair in a white bath towel and walked out. She smiled and said, "Dear, what do you want to eat? There should be enough time to fry 2 pieces of bread." There was no one in the bedroom. Helen's voice stopped indifferently. She walked to the bedside with a complicated expression. She counted the cigarette butts in the ashtray and then walked to the dressing table. The 2 extremely thin strands of black hair still rested on the black keyboard area of the metallic phone. Helen's expression suddenly relaxed. Her right hand moved away from her wet head and lightly patted her naked chest. She was a little scared, but also a little satisfied. Fried bread is not nutritious enough. The masters of the trade office are not that easy to serve. A concerned voice came from the door. Shi Qinghai was half naked, wearing only casual shorts. He held a frying pan in his left hand. The eggs inside were being baked under the residual heat and gradually solidified. He held a wooden spatula in his right hand and a half-smoked cigarette in his mouth. Looking at the mesmerizing appearance of this man, coupled with the fact that she was gradually beginning to believe him, Helen spontaneously felt a sense of warmth and relaxation. Suddenly, she felt a little ashamed that she had been using the trade office secretary as a cover for her real job. She walked up and hugged Shi Qinghai's body tightly. She slowly twisted her body and said infatuatedly, "Lulu, I want to eat you in the morning." Shi Qinghai held the frying pan and the wooden spatula high, afraid that the naked body of the woman in his arms would be burned. Feeling the slide of the woman in front of his chest, he couldn't help but feel a little moved. He spat the cigarette butt on the floor and lowered his head to kiss her. The faint smoke of the number 37 brand cigarette began to swirl between the lips and tongues of this man and woman. It began to diffuse into the air and covered the true face and heart of each other. Sula didn't know that the shameless brother who didn't know that he was already a father was using the most shameless method to approach Senator Macklin step by step. He also didn't know that the fake name Mr. Sher, who had a pair of peach blossom eyes, was actually related to him. Otherwise, he might have been very angry. At this time, he was locked up alone in a military prison. He didn't know the name of this military prison, but since it was in the capital special district, and the security measures were so strict, the level of this prison must not be too low. This was a single cell. The high-strength plastic ropes on his hands and feet were not removed. It seemed that after tonight, the other party was very clear about Su Li's ability, and dared not to be the slightest bit careless. This cell was entirely made of plastic, including the bed. The light from the corridor outside the grill shone in, making this place seem particularly lonely. Su Lu was lying on the bed, his tightly bound hands flat in front of his chest. His mind was in a mess, and his mind was clear at the same time. Every time he thought of the cold existence at the end of the black dream, his mind was a little confused. He had learned from Uncle Feng Yu since he was young, read all the books in Heshi State University, and spent so many days in the Husk Institute. He was sure that the technology level of the Federation was tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands, of years away from the appearance of artificial intelligence. However, the central computer under the Bureau of Proclamation seemed to have been in operation since the time of the Group of Five. The history before the catastrophe had long been lost in the long river of chaos. The computer had been in operation until now, but it hadn't been pulled apart by the gradual development of human society's technology. This was a very scary fact in itself. Although the first charter stated that the Federal Central Computer had been constantly improving and upgrading, subconsciously, Su Lu didn't believe this. However, the ability to learn and upgrade by oneself was not artificial intelligence. He thought of the conversation in the black dream and couldn't help but frown. If the central computer didn't actively help him, then could it be that the big shots in the Bureau of Proclamation did something? Thinking of the mysterious and ancient Bureau of Proclamation, Su Li's chaotic mind was even more confused. He didn't like this feeling of confusion, so he began to analyze his current situation and gradually calmed down. Destroying the Federation's confidential data was definitely a serious crime. If someone accused him of being a spy, perhaps the military court would sentence him to death immediately. If he was found to be involved in Park Ji-ho's death at the entrance of Husan Mountain, the only thing he would receive in return would still be a death sentence. The sober Su Lu didn't seem to be worried about this. He quietly looked at the shiny plastic ceiling and calculated the time in his mind. He wanted to see if the lady of the Tai family was willing to take a gamble. The data in the laboratory was related to the development of the new generation of mecha in the Federation. It was very important, and the benefits were not small, especially when it was related to the presidential election. Even if Lady Tai didn't want to stand up for a small character like herself, she still had to consider for Representative Pabre. The most important problem now was that Lady Tai needed to make a decision. After Su Lu was arrested, it seemed that he couldn't control the data in the laboratory anymore. If she made a move now, it might be too late. The synonym for too late was often to give up. Su Lu understood this very well, so he wanted to see if the other party was willing to bet that he still had something in his hands. Even if Lady Tai gave up on him, Su Lu wouldn't fall into despair because Zhou Yu had already returned to the compound of the Ministry of Defense. Moreover, he still had a metal bracelet on his wrist. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but sigh softly as he lay on the bed. Other than the structural diagram of the little blue device, the most important thing in the bracelet was those strange maps. In the past, he didn't understand why Uncle Feng Yu kept those maps like they were treasures. It wasn't until today when he was arrested and locked up in the military prison that he started to understand. "Uncle, how many times were you arrested by the Federation in the past? And how many times did you escape prison?" He praised with mixed feelings. The door of the cell was opened. Two soldiers escorted Su Lu along the quiet corridor and walked out. It was still early in the morning. The prisoners in the cells on both sides of the corridor had just woken up. They looked at the newcomer in confusion, wondering if he was going to be executed directly since he was taken out so early. As soon as he thought of this, the corridor fell silent. There was actually no sound of jeering or strange shouting. Su Lu sat at one end of the metal table and looked at the soldier in the distance who had lowered his head. He couldn't see the soldier's face clearly. He frowned slightly. The military prison was naturally under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Defense. If it was Deputy Minister Zhou who sent someone here, it would make sense. However, this reaction speed was faster than he had expected. Moreover, the person who sent him surprised him a little. The soldier heard the noise and slowly raised her head, revealing an unfamiliar but beautiful face. She said in a clear voice, "My name is Su Songzi. I belong to the Legal Department of the Internal Affairs Department of the Ministry of Defense. I have been assigned to provide legal support to Second Lieutenant Su Lo." This was a female civilian officer. She was very beautiful. After she raised her body from the table, it could be seen that her body was also very beautiful. Su Lo moved his body with some difficulty. He squinted his eyes and said, "Thank you." The female officer Su Songzi looked at Su Lo and suddenly said coldly, "Destroying the core secrets of the Federation is a serious crime. The starting sentence is 3 years. The highest sentence can be death. If you don't want to be prosecuted for espionage, I advise you to plead guilty. This way, I can try to plead with the judge in the military court." Su Lo confirmed that the other party was sent by Deputy Minister Zhou because the Internal Affairs Department of the Ministry of Defense happened to be the department directly under Zhou Yingxing. But for some reason, this female legal officer named Su Songzi didn't seem to have any good intentions towards him. "I don't plead guilty." Su Songzi lowered her head. There was a trace of anger and mockery on her face. Although it was only midnight, the surveillance video and testimony provided by the Husk Institute were very complete. It seemed that the second lieutenant in front of her was so stupid that he relied on his background in the Ministry of Defense. Didn't he know that even if he was Deputy Minister Zhou's son-in-law, he couldn't be completely fine under such circumstances? "I advise you to be sober." "I'm very sober. But I think that before you came, you didn't do your research properly." Su Lo looked at the female officer on the other side of the long metal table. He lowered his head and said, "You probably don't know. That laboratory is mine. I've been having diarrhea for the past few days, and it's especially serious today. I've already become Wu Lao Air. My whole body is weak, and I really can't take it anymore. The leader has bought some medicine, and I've already taken it. I should be fine, but I'm only able to write 1 chapter today." Chapter 192. Su Songzi looked at the young second lieutenant at the other end of the long metal table in shock. She had graduated from the 1st Military Academy's Law Department 2 years ago and had performed very well in the Department of National Defense's Internal Affairs Department. She had never encountered a case that made her back off. However, in the middle of the night, she was woken up by a call from her immediate superior, who ordered her to immediately rush to the military prison to provide legal support for a client. Suddenly receiving such a strange order and being disturbed from her sleep naturally put her in a bad mood. When she saw the witness and material evidence provided by the Nutshell Research Institute and the Military Police Brigade, the displeasure in her heart reached its peak. A suspect officer who could get the Department of National Defense to voluntarily provide legal support in the middle of the night was undoubtedly someone with a strong background. In her eyes, this young second lieutenant named Su Lo was just one of the countless playboys in the Federation. However, this playboy was especially stupid. She didn't know what ridiculous reason he had, but he actually caused a ruckus in the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute. These people really didn't know how to spell the word death. With prejudice in front of her, she naturally didn't have a good attitude towards Su Lo. However, due to her professionalism, she still seriously provided the other party with reference opinions and persuaded the other party to admit his guilt. However, she didn't expect that the suspect officer across the long table would directly reject her and even give a reason that she didn't think of before. "The lab is yours." Su Songzi was stunned, then immediately laughed sarcastically. She quietly looked at Su Lo across the long table and said, "I didn't hear wrong, right?" After she graduated from the 1st Military Academy, she directly entered the Department of National Defense's Internal Affairs Department. Her performance was extremely outstanding, and she was deeply appreciated by her superiors. However, because of the limited research area, she didn't know who the authority of the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute belonged to. She only knew that the Federation's Research Institute, which controlled a considerable amount of cutting-edge technology, belonged to the Federation and the military. However, this person actually said that the lab was his. Su Lo felt this female officer's attitude towards him, so he lowered his head and said, you can check the agreement between the Institute and Professor Shen. From the beginning of the establishment of this lab, a cooperative model was chosen. Starting from the 54th year of the constitutional calendar, all the sponsorship was obtained by Professor Shen in his own name. From this point of view, everything in this lab, including the data that I destroyed, can only be paid by the Federation or the shell company according to the agreement. They have the right to use, but they don't have the right to dispose of it. Su Songzi listened to these words, and her expression gradually calmed down. She realized that she really didn't know much about the Husk Institute. The other party seemed to be very organized, and it didn't seem like he was lying. Moreover, he was already arrested and imprisoned, so lying to her at this time wouldn't do him any good. Before Professor Shin passed away, through a notarized will, the right to dispose of the lab was fully transferred to me. Su Lu raised his head, looked at the beautiful female officer across the long table, and said calmly, "The spare parts of the legal documents are in my apartment. You can check them at any time, if no one destroys them." Su Songzi heard the confidence hidden in the young second lieutenant's calm words. She slightly frowned, lowered her head, and looked at the file on the table again. She slowly said, "In the statements of the Institute and the military police, this point was not mentioned. Of course, I will immediately verify it, but, if what you said is true, then I don't understand why you destroyed the confidential data in the lab. You should know that those data are important data that has been electronically protected by the central database of the Federation." Her gaze paused on the file, and she couldn't help but shake her head lightly. What kind of officer was this? He actually carried a peace axe and barged into the Institute and smashed up a lab. These data are mine. Do I need to explain how I want to dispose of them? At this time, Su Lu naturally wouldn't tell the female officer about the Federal Academy of Science, the Iron Schemer, and the new generation of mecha from the Federation. This wouldn't do him any good in his current situation. In fact, it would only make things worse. Thank you very much for coming to provide me with legal aid. I think I've already made myself very clear. The data is mine, and the lab is mine. Since that's the case, there is no reason for me to still be locked up in prison. I want to know, when can I get out? Su Songzi didn't raise her head. She pushed the file in front of her away, opened the electronic legal document, and flipped through it carefully with furrowed brows for a long time. Then, she raised her head and looked quietly at Su Lu. She shook her head and said, "Even if that lab used to be Professor Shen's and is now yours, you still can't get out after destroying those data." "Why?" Su Lu placed his hands, which were bound by the plastic rope, on the table. He looked at her and asked, "Is there a problem with me disciplining my own child?" Hearing this analogy, Su Songzi raised her head and looked quietly at Su Lu. She said, "Let's not talk about whether this analogy is appropriate or not. Even if this is your own son, you can educate him, but you can't abuse him, and you can't kill him. If you do, then you will violate the Child Protection Act or become a murderer." Without waiting for Su Lu to speak, she furrowed her brows and continued to say, "According to the Federation's Confidential Information Protection Act, even if this data is yours, it still has to be monitored by the Federation due to its importance. It cannot be leaked, and it cannot be arbitrarily disposed of. Your right to dispose of this data can, at most, allow you to get a lighter sentence in this case." Su Lu lowered his head, took a deep breath, and smiled somewhat helplessly. Su Songzi saw his smile and was slightly stunned. She didn't understand why he could still smile so calmly at a time like this. Did he really think that with the background of the Ministry of Defense, he could go against the laws of the Federation? She slightly furrowed her brows and said, "Not to mention, this is all what you said. I haven't seen the relevant electronic legal documents yet. But since there is new evidence, I will continue to investigate." Su Songzi stood up and began to tidy up the documents on the metal table. She lowered her head and said, "You sign a document later. In the morning, I will go directly to your apartment to get the legal document, and then I will go directly to the Military Inspection Department to apply for evidence preservation." "I don't know if the legal document in the apartment is still there," Su Lu suddenly said. Su Songzi's movements slightly paused, and a sense of displeasure rose in her heart. She thought to herself, if it's not there, then where did your previous confidence come from? Su Lu lowered his head. He didn't know if the Li family would enter his apartment to destroy Professor Shin's will. Although logically speaking, those big shots shouldn't use such a boring little trick, for the sake of safety, he would rather pretend that the copy was no longer there. He raised his head and said, the original legal document is, in the hands of a friend of mine. You can go directly to her and ask for it. Friend? Where does she live? Department of National Defense, Shishan Compound Number 3. Her surname is Zhou. Su Songzi heard this address and was slightly stunned. She immediately took a deep breath and immediately understood why her immediate superior would call her in the middle of the night and send her to the prison. It turned out that the backer of this young second lieutenant was her immediate superior's immediate superior. Got it. She looked at Su Le thoughtfully and then prepared to leave. At this moment, there was a sound of footsteps outside the reception room. Inspector Xiao, this way please. An inspector about 30 years old, accompanied by the military prison chief, walked into the reception room. This inspector with the surname Xiao had black hair and looked very capable. When he found that Su Songzi was also in the room, he couldn't help but be slightly surprised. He smiled and asked, Songzi, why are you here? Brother Wenjing. Su Songzi was also a little surprised. She glanced at Su Lu from the corner of her eyes. She didn't know what this young second lieutenant had done to alarm the powerful people of the Capital District Prosecutor's office. This is Second Lieutenant Su Lu. I was ordered to take him away to assist in the investigation of a case. After exchanging a few pleasantries with Su Songzi, Inspector Xiao went straight to the point. Su Songzi's eyebrows furrowed. She knew the current status of this senior from the law department in the district prosecutor's office. Why had he come here? The strangest thing was that her client, Su Lu, was an active soldier. He should have gone through the federal military's internal legal procedures. Why was the district prosecutor's office interfering? No, this is my client. For some reason, Su Songzi felt a little strange. Without waiting for Su Lu to stand up, she directly rejected this request. Inspector Xiao smiled and took out a document from the briefcase in his hand and put it on the table. Su Songzi picked up the document and looked at it. Her face became serious. She looked at the military prison chief and said, according to the sequence, Su Lu is a military suspect. He must stay in the military prison. Immediately after, she turned to Inspector Xiao and asked in a low voice, what is going on? I am now his legal support lawyer. You should know the sequence of the case very well. He is now involved in the serious crime of destroying the Federation's confidential information. At least wait until the case in my hands is over before you can take over. Su Songzi was very familiar with Xiao Wenjing, so she didn't think too much about what she said. She stared into his eyes and asked in confusion, even if he has other cases, it should be the police headquarters who investigate first. Why did the district prosecutor's office interfere in advance? Inspector Xiao shrugged and glanced at Su Lu, who was silently lowering his head at the table. He moved closer to Su Songzi's ear and said, the sequence of the case and the early interference are actually all for the same reason. This officer committed a serious crime. You should know very well that the sequence of the case is often divided according to the severity of the crime. When the district prosecutor's office encounters this kind of vicious case, they will also interfere in advance. Su Songzi frowned. What kind of serious crime could be more serious than destroying the Federation's confidential data? Or a vicious case that required the district prosecutor's office to interfere in advance? Murder. There was a trace of indifference in Inspector Zhao's eyes. He looked at Su Lu at the table in the distance and said, Second Lieutenant Su Lu is suspected of murdering an active duty officer, Park Ji-ho, on the side of the road on Hushan Road last night. According to the Federation's temporary regulations on handling cases involving military personnel, this case is under our jurisdiction. Chapter 193. It was late spring in the suburbs of the capital. Flowers, trees, and leaves shaded the morning sun. It was extremely peaceful. A police car silently moved forward in this beautiful environment. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the scenery of the capital through the observation window. His expression was calm, but no one knew what he was thinking. His hands and feet were still tightly bound. From a suspect of destroying confidential data of the Federation to a suspect of felony murder, the guard duty had been changed from military police to fully armed police, but the security did not decrease in the slightest. He knew very well that regarding the investigation of these two cases, the Federation's relevant government departments were extraordinarily efficient. It was only midnight, but they had actually provided sufficient evidence. And at this time, he was transferred from the military prison to the district prosecutor's office. Naturally, it was the Lee family's operation. With the hidden power of the 7 major Federation families, it was not difficult to influence the speed of the Federation's judicial department. The other side should have known beforehand that he had a strange relationship with Deputy Minister Zhou Yingxing, but they had been unable to confirm it. When they knew that the female officer of the Ministry of National Defense had entered the prison that night, they immediately threw out the second plan, which was to transfer Sulu to the district prosecutor's office. The Deputy Minister of National Defense might be able to influence everything in the military prison, but his influence on the Federation's judicial department was not that strong, at least compared to the Lee family. "Do you have anything to say?" Su Songzi sat beside Su Lu and narrowed her eyes at the person she was dealing with. She was somewhat surprised by the other party's calmness. Logically speaking, she was dealing with the case of Su Lu destroying confidential data of the Federation. As for the case of the murder of active duty military officer Park Ji-ho, under the circumstances that there was no follow-up order from the higher-ups, she could completely ignore it and not follow Su Lu to the district prosecutor's office. But for some reason, Su Songzi felt that this matter was a bit strange. Why would this young second lieutenant, who clearly had Deputy Minister Zhou as his backer, suddenly lose his mind? First, he cold-bloodedly killed people on Hushan Road, then crazily broke into the research institute and smashed it. There was obviously something behind this matter, but unfortunately, Sulu was not willing to reveal anything to her. "Thank you." After Sulu said these 2 words, he immediately shut his mouth. He knew very well that what awaited him in the district prosecutor's office would definitely be a torrential storm from the Federation's judicial system. The female officer beside him might be an outstanding judicial talent, but she wouldn't be of any use in this matter. Deputy Minister Zhou had already made his move. Although it was not a strong move, and it was even possible that Zhou had used her father's name to secretly help, it was still a small warning to that side. Sulu was only thinking about whether the Tai family would make a move after he entered the district procurator general's office. He was waiting. He even vaguely guessed that the reason why the Maestro family was putting so much pressure on him was probably because they were waiting to see the true relationship between him and the Tai family. They wanted to see if the madam would actually care about him. A photo that had been enlarged to 12 inches was gently placed on the table, right in front of Su Li's eyes. The photo was a close-up shot. The throat that had been cut open by a blade looked extremely bloody and terrifying, especially the white trachea that could be faintly seen inside. The blood that had already coagulated flowed down the corpse's cheeks, wetting a large patch of blonde hair. When mixed together, it was as black as ink. Su Lu quietly looked at the large photo in front of him. His expression did not change at all, but the corners of his eyes twitched. Inspector Xiao Wenjing had been silently observing his expression from the side. He walked up coldly and placed 7 or 8 photos in front of Su Lu. He did not ask a single question. He only used the photos that had been enlarged to the extreme to show the horrible state of the corpse and the wounds, as well as the silence in the interrogation room, to pressure Su Lu. "Do you know the victim?" "Yes, Park Ji-ho. We participated in the Shell Motor Company's spring recruitment exam together." If it was said that when Su Lu killed Park Ji-ho last night, there was still a trace of sadness and frustration in his heart. But now, when he looked at these enlarged photos, he was able to maintain absolute calmness. Other than the slight twitch in the corner of his eyes at the beginning, his expression was as calm as usual. But it was this calmness that exposed the problem. Xiao Wenjing coldly looked at his face. He knew that his judgment was not wrong. This young second lieutenant in front of him was definitely the murderer. It was just that he could not determine his motive at the moment. Last night at 9:40, where were you? An assistant inspector from the district prosecutor's office asked in a mechanical voice. With a click, Xiao Wenjing lit a cigarette. I can't remember the exact time, but I should have been on the way back to the apartment. You didn't work at the research institute yesterday afternoon. Why did you come back so late? My girlfriend is pregnant. We had a pregnancy checkup last night. Girlfriend? Name? Zhou Yu. Su Songzi, who had been listening in the interrogation room, maintained her silence. At this time, when she heard the name of Su Li's girlfriend, she could not help but frown. Only now did she know that this young second lieutenant was actually the future son-in-law of Deputy Minister Zhou. She could not help but think of the recent news that the minister's daughter was pregnant before marriage. Did you pass by Hushan Road? I forgot. Forgot? There was a fight at the entrance of Hushan Road, and we've already invited the people involved. They've already confirmed that you participated in that fight and injured 8 people. How could you forget such a big thing? It doesn't matter if you forgot. The testimony of the witnesses and the surveillance video at the entrance will definitely help you remember. Su Lu slowly raised his head. The tiredness of the night made him slightly anxious at this time. In an extremely unusual way, he retorted with a harsh sentence, I never remember the time when I was chased by a dog. The second district prosecutor's office in the capital was extremely efficient. They had completely grasped Su Li's whereabouts in the first half of the night yesterday. They had also obtained the testimony of the young masters of the Federation. The most important thing was that these people testified that after Su Lu killed 8 of their people, he took a knife and directly rushed to the mountain at Hushan Road. 4 hours later, the body of the active military officer, Park Ji-ho, was found on the cliff. The conclusion from the forensics department is out. According to the testimony of the witnesses, the knife model was just right to cause the fatal wound on the neck of the deceased. Su Lu lowered his head. He did not expect that the young masters and bodyguards that he had beaten up would provide such crucial testimony. After all, he was not a professional killer, nor was he a professional criminal. At that time, he really did not care about these things. However, the knife had long been thrown into the stream in the ivy garden. Presumably, the 7th young master of the Li family did not have the intention to betray him. It should be noted that Park Ji-ho's body was found a few hours later. A lot of the real-time evidence was eliminated, all thanks to the delay of the 7th young master of the Li family. You took a knife, rushed to the cliff, and cold-bloodedly and cruelly killed a young and outstanding Federation officer. The assistant prosecutor saw that Su Lu had sunk into silence, so he continued unhurriedly, the chain of evidence is already very complete. I advise you to plead guilty in time. We will plead for you to the judge. Su Lu was still silent. However, when he heard the words plead guilty, he subconsciously glanced at the female officer, Su Songzi, who was sitting quietly not far away, and smiled. Prosecutor Xiao shook his head slightly. He knew that before there was actual evidence, this cold-blooded second lieutenant would not speak. He signaled to the assistant prosecutor, patted Su Li's shoulder, and led him out of the interrogation room. Su Songzi also stood up. It was unknown whether it was a coincidence or a deliberate arrangement by the district prosecutor's office, but the two groups of people who should not have met each other ran into each other. Su Lu, whose hands and feet were tied, narrowed his eyes as he looked at the mother and daughter hugging each other and crying by the corridor. There was also a middle-aged man who was desperately smoking by the side. His movements subconsciously slowed down. The crying mother had blonde hair, and the middle-aged man looked a lot like Park Ji-ho. From his clothes, he should be from an extraordinary family. You are the killer? The middle-aged man's eyes were bloodshot. He could not understand how his only son had died just like that. He glared at Su Lu fiercely, as if he wanted to swallow him whole. The mother and daughter hugging each other and crying were Park Ji-ho's mother and younger sister. The mother, who had just experienced the pain of losing her son, lunged at Su Lu like an injured female beast. Her fingers desperately dug at his face, accompanied by heart-wrenching cries. The sharp fingernails were only an inch away from Su Li's eyes. The district prosecutor's office desperately tried to stop the angry family members of the victims, and it took a lot of effort to calm the chaos in the corridor. Park Ji-ho's younger sister was about 13 or 14 years old. She stared at Su Li's face with an extremely cold and angry gaze, and spat on his face. "You'd better stay in prison forever." Park Ji-ho's father hugged his wife, looked at Su Lu who was lowering his head and wiping his saliva, and said in a trembling voice, "Or I will definitely kill you, making such a personal threat in front of the prosecutors, but the prosecutors did not have the slightest intention of stopping them. They just coldly pushed Su Lu away. Outside the iron gate of the temporary detention center, Prosecutor Xiao Wenjing looked at Su Lu and said, "If I were you, I would plead guilty earlier. Otherwise, there will be a lot of hard days ahead. You don't have direct evidence, you don't have witnesses, you don't have a knife, you don't have anything." Su Songzi followed behind Prosecutor Xiao and said quickly, "Use your own professional qualities to judge whether he is the murderer or not." Prosecutor Xiao suddenly turned around, stared at Su Songzi, and said quickly and angrily in a low voice, "If he is not the murderer, I will cut off my head and give it to you." What is the motive? And the most important thing is that we are professionals. We have to believe, and can only believe, the evidence. Xiao Wenjing threw the finished cigarette at his feet. He had not slept in the middle of the night, and his eyes were a little sunken. He said with a hint of sarcasm, "I will find the evidence, but I didn't expect that the researchers of the Husk Institute would be so cold-blooded." Su Songzi was silent. She knew that the enlarged bloody photos and the encounter with the family members of the victims in the corridor were all psychological attacks that Prosecutor Xiao was good at. But looking at Su Li's calm expression, it seemed that he was not affected at all. It might be reasonable to say that the young second lieutenant was cold-blooded. "The girlfriend he mentioned earlier is the daughter of our deputy minister Zhou." "I know, but I don't care about that." Prosecutor Xiao stamped out the cigarette by his feet. Su Songzi looked at his expression and suddenly had an ominous thought. She looked at him and said, "What are you going to do?" "As a judicial officer, I will not do things like extorting confessions by torture." "Don't worry." Xiao Wenjing turned around and walked towards the interrogation room. He said gloomily, "But he should feel what he should feel." Chapter 194. Su Songzi stayed in Xiao Wenjing's office. Previously, she had listened in on the interrogation room, which was actually a bit against protocol. However, she still had another case on Su Lu, and her relationship with Xiao Wenjing had always been good, so the district prosecutor's office didn't make things difficult for her. Next to the office was the hall of the district prosecutor's office's second section. The staff were busy with the case at hand, but the sudden sound of excitement still made many people raise their heads. Su Songzi looked over curiously through the glass. She didn't know what evidence these inspectors had found. "Inspector Xiao, the car has been found." A middle-aged official in his 40s looked at Xiao Wenjing and said happily, "It's in the night parking lot at the side of the courtyard. I didn't expect that kid to have no intention of destroying the evidence at all." The murder on Hushan Road involved 2 active officers in the Shell Motor Company. The matter was very troublesome. Under pressure from certain parties, the district prosecutor's office intercepted the case as quickly as possible. The most important thing at the moment was, of course, to collect evidence of Su Li's involvement in the case. The black car that was testified by witnesses to have stopped on Hushan Road was naturally the most important thing. Xiao Wenjing's spirits were lifted. She took out a box of biscuits and chewed on 2 pieces. She quickly asked, "Has it been sent to the forensics department?" He paused for a moment and said, "Directly scan it with fluorescent light. Even if the car was washed, there should still be blood stains on it. Also, tell the guys in charge of organizing the cleanup to be more careful. The car was found half an hour ago. It went straight to the forensics department." Xiao Wenjing drank a mouthful of tea and smiled. She thought that as long as the evidence was found on the black car, the young second lieutenant with a background would never be able to escape. However, the development of the facts was always the opposite of what the investigators thought. After 10 minutes, the excited middle-aged staff member from before pushed open the glass door with a sullen face. He walked to Xiao Wenjing's desk and lowered his voice. He said in a strange tone, "No evidence was found." Xiao Wenjing moved her gaze away from the files on the table and slowly stood up. She stared at the subordinate in front of her, indicating that she didn't understand what he said at all. Even if they couldn't find the knife in a car that had been left behind by the suspect in the parking lot, there should be some traces of the victim's blood left behind. With the current technology of the Federation, they could find even the tiniest trace of blood. The other party did a very professional job and carried out a thorough cleaning. You can even say that this black car is now a new car that just left the factory. The middle-aged official lowered his head and said dejectedly. Xiao Wenjing noticed the words professional and couldn't help but sink into silence. The higher-ups were putting a lot of pressure on the district attorney's office. They were determined to turn Second Lieutenant Su Li's case into an ironclad one. With his good relationship with the higher-ups, he even knew where the pressure came from. However, he didn't have any conflicting emotions. This was because during the previous interrogation, he had confirmed that Su Li was the murderer. Who was helping Su Li destroy the evidence? To be able to clean a car with a complicated structure in such a short period of time without leaving a trace, why didn't such a powerful force directly destroy the car? Xiao Wenjing's brows furrowed like a distorted Chinese character. He took a deep breath and waved his hand to have his subordinate leave the office. He lowered his head again to look at the files on the table. There were no traces of the victim's blood on the suspect Su Li's body. It was said that before entering the military prison last night, he had changed his clothes. And before he was locked up, he even used the military's powerful cleansing powder to carry out a thorough cleansing. Originally, he was just a little regretful that the military prison's cleansing had destroyed the direct evidence that the district attorney's office might have gotten from Su Li. Now that he thought about the black car that could no longer be used as evidence, he couldn't help but think, could it be that from the beginning, there was another group of people in the government secretly helping this suspect get off the hook? Could it be the Ministry of National Defense's Deputy Minister Zhou? Xiao Wenjing looked at the pictures of the crime scene on the table. Suddenly, he angrily slammed the table. The teacup shook and fell to the ground, shattering into pieces. The sound alarmed the staff outside the office. They all looked over with concern. They didn't know why their boss was so angry. The detention center behind the district attorney's office was filled with serious criminals. These criminals had already been interrogated by the police and sent to the district attorney's office to await trial. Some of them were sent back by the court for additional investigation. The lights in the detention center were bright, and the surveillance facilities were complete. Also, it was deep behind the district attorney's office. There had never been a prison break. The defense work was basically handed over to the electronic surveillance network, so there weren't many people. There were no beds in the room, only 2 rows of benches connected to the high-strength plastic wall. Su Li sat on one of the benches and calculated the time. Then, he turned his head and used his finger to write something on the wall. However, he couldn't leave a mark, so the other prisoners in the same room couldn't see it. The data is already in my hands. Next, I need to wait for the Tai family's response. Then, I need to enter the engineering department and create the new generation mecha. At the same time, I need to finish modifying the simulation system that I want to use. Then, I need to find a way to implant my own control program into the prototype mecha in the warehouse. Senator Macklin is already in cahoots with the Iron Calculator family. His campaign funds are abundant. If Dean Lin from the Federal Academy of Science continues to support him, then Pabre's side will be in trouble. If I can make the Federal Academy of Science lose face during the research on the new mecha, then their alliance will be much weaker. I think that Dean Lin won't have the face to stand on the political stage again. After the assassination, the Tai family wasn't willing to deal with Senator Macklin directly. That was because there was no evidence. Moreover, the rules of the game between the upper echelons of the Federation are like this. If Senator Ross and Senator Macklin really become the president, then the most I can do is get my hands on a mecha. What use can it be? Su Lu silently wrote on the wall. Ever since that firework display, he had cried in the cafe of the 1st Military Region's living area. The smile on the young man's plain face had decreased a lot, and he had become much quieter. No one knew what he was thinking in his heart. Tai Xuan didn't know. Shi Qinghai didn't know. Zhou Yu didn't know. That mysterious and omnipresent Tai family also didn't know. Only he himself knew. He had been waiting for a certain moment. If the laws of the Federation didn't satisfy him, then he would become the law himself. This was an arrogant and wrong idea, but Su Lu persisted. The arrest of the young second lieutenant of the Husk Institute didn't attract much attention at this time. No one knew that at this time, he was repeating the plan that he had been repeating for half a year. That plan that seemed a little whimsical. The district prosecutor's office questioned him 3 times. Other than the first time, when Su Lu said something, he remained silent for the rest of the time. He watched as the minutes and seconds passed. It was already late at night. He seemed calm, but in reality, he was beginning to have a strange feeling in his heart. Could it be that even with the wisdom of the madam of the Tai family, she couldn't understand what kind of impact the Federal Academy of Science would have on the voters if they were biased in the election? Or could it be that the political power represented by the Tai family had determined that the Academy of Science had already obtained the data and didn't believe that they still had the capital? Right at this time, the lights in the corridor suddenly dimmed. The night sky outside the window mixed with the faint moonlight and sprinkled into the cell. The atmosphere in the cell that had been silent all day suddenly became strange. There were 6 people in this cell. Other than Su Lu, who had been silently pondering, there was another person who had also been silent. That person was still silent. Other than him and Su Lu, the other 4 people stood up and walked towards Su Lu, who was in the corner. The person in the lead had a fierce face. He was about 1.85 meters tall. His arms were hanging by his side like they were cast from iron, swinging non-stop. That person lit a cigarette and looked at Su Lu with a gloomy and cold gaze. A buzzing sound was heard. The 3 surveillance cameras around the cell suddenly turned off. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the surveillance camera. He seemed to have understood something. Although he had never been in prison before, he was still an orphan. He didn't know how many times he had heard from Li Wei about the black prison. That big guy laughed silently and smashed his fist towards Su Li's head. The other people around him also pounced at the same time. It seemed like they wanted to beat Su Lu to death. Su Lu stood up. His feet moved quickly within the small space on the ground. He struck the armpit, elbows, knees. His movements were extremely fast and clean. He fiercely kicked the lower abdomen of the person beside him. That person groaned and was kicked 3 meters away. He fell heavily onto the plastic wall. Before he could fall to the ground, he vomited blood and fainted. He turned around and blocked the big guy's arm. He raised his arm and elbowed the guy's sternum. The big guy was like an iron tower that lost its balance. With a crack, he collapsed under his feet. In less than 3 seconds, all the people surrounding him fell to the ground. The big guy's sternum seemed to be broken. He kept breathing heavily and blood seeped out of his mouth. The people on the ground looked at Su Lu as if they were looking at a monster. They couldn't even get up, let alone attack again. Su Lu took out a cigarette and lighter from the big guy's body. He sat back on the bench and silently lit one for himself. After thinking for a while, he took out a cigarette and threw it at the guy who had been silent the whole time. Between the 2 of them, the 4 prisoners were still tossing and turning in pain. They desperately wanted to get as far away as possible from the terrifying guy Su Lu. The big guy painfully held on to the edge of the bench next to Su Lu. He wanted to crawl further away, but the pain in his chest made him lack the strength. He could only resign himself to his fate and lean against Su Li's side. He took deep breaths. I didn't know that the Federation's laws allowed the prosecutors to use such despicable methods. The guy who had been silent the whole time took Su Li's cigarette and put it next to him. He forced a smile and said, "I don't understand what you mean." At this moment, the lights in the corridor lit up. The surveillance camera started to work again. The door of the cell opened. The guy looked at Su Li cautiously and left the cell under the protection of a guard. Su Li didn't move. He sat alone on the bench and smoked the cigarette. His two fingers that were holding the cigarette were slightly trembling. If the situation didn't change by tomorrow morning, it meant that the Tai family, who could change everything, didn't want to directly go against the Li family and the Federal Academy of Science for something that they didn't need. Then he had to think of a way himself. He lit another cigarette, lowered his body, and put it in the big guy's mouth. Chapter 195. Inspector Xiao, your method is useless. That guy doesn't look like a civilian soldier at all. He took down 3 in one move. The guy who had been silent in the cell was a staff member of the District Procurator General's office. He stood in front of Xiao Wenjing and hesitated for a moment before saying, "This is illegal. What if someone finds out? I've never asked you to do this before." Xiao Wenjing rubbed his throbbing temples and turned his head to look at the capital's night view outside the window. "Don't worry. If anything happens, I'll take care of it for you." Xiao Wenjing had never used such a despicable and shameless method before. The capital planet's media was well developed, and the people were vigilant. The people in the judicial system had always done things appropriately and properly. However, Xiao Wenjing was under too much pressure from above today. Plus, he knew that Su Li was the murderer, but he couldn't find any direct evidence at the moment, so he had to use the old method from decades ago. Despicable methods were often the most useful methods. Unfortunately, this method didn't seem to have any effect in front of that young second lieutenant called Su Li. I shouldn't have untied the plastic ropes on his hands and feet in the first place. Xiao Wenjing's eyes turned cold. As an excellent inspector, he had seen all the crimes in the Federation. He wasn't someone who got angry easily, but for some reason, he got angry easily when facing that young second lieutenant called Su Li. He didn't know where this anger came from. Maybe it was because he knew that the other party was the murderer but couldn't find any evidence. No, Xiao Wenjing often encountered this kind of thing. He should be angry because of that young second lieutenant's cold-bloodedness. No, cold-blooded psychopathic murderers weren't rare in the Federation. What exactly am I angry about? Xiao Wenjing was shocked and fell into silence. She gradually understood. What made him angry was that it was obviously a simple case, but because of the pressure from his superiors, he had to use some illegal and despicable means. This situation made him feel angry. He took a sip of the strong tea and felt the bitterness on his tongue. After a moment of silence, he said, "Since they are making trouble in the cell, then tie up the hands and feet of the suspect." Today, for the sake of the murder suspect, he had already cooperated with Xiao Wenjing to do something illegal, but he didn't expect that his boss would still insist on it. If this matter was known by his superiors or the reporters, not only would the reputation of the district prosecutor's office be ruined, but the involved Inspector Xiao and himself would never be able to stand out again. He subconsciously wanted to disobey this order because it was illegal. As an inspector, he had enough reason to refuse and could even report it to his superiors. However, because of his trust in Inspector Xiao Wenjing and his close cooperation with the second section, his reaction was a bit slower. At this moment, an inspector pushed open the door and came in with news that dispelled his worries. It was the middle-aged inspector who was in charge of the black car identification during the day. He looked at Xiao Wenjing with a strange expression and said, "Inspector Xiao, the case on Hushan Road, someone has turned himself in." When Xiao Wenjing heard this, his hands pressed weakly on the table. With his intelligence, he naturally knew that the forces trying to protect the real murderer had begun to counterattack. However, he didn't expect that the other party's counterattack would be so despicable and despicable. Using a scapegoat was a boring method that could only be seen in mafia movies. Did the other party think that this would make the district prosecutor's office give up on the investigation of the vicious murder case on Hushan Road? However, Great Inspector Xiao had forgotten that he had previously used despicable methods that could only be seen in mafia movies. The entire Federation's judicial system was already somewhat unfamiliar with such despicable methods. Moreover, he should also be clear that such despicable methods were often the most powerful. He supported himself on the table and tried to control his anger, but he found it more and more difficult to control it. He even felt that slamming the table heavily was not enough to express the emotions in his heart. Throwing a teacup. One had already been thrown during the day, and now there was only one left in the office, the person who came to turn himself in was a hooligan from the slums of Wangdu. Looking through the glass window at the hooligan's indifferent expression, Xiao Wenjing knew that this scapegoat was the kind of scapegoat she was most afraid of. This kind of scapegoat didn't care about anything as long as they got money. Going to jail was the same as going home. Nowadays, there weren't many death sentences in the Federation, but there were quite a few hundreds of years in prison. Although the case involved the murder of an active Federation officer, from the mouth of the hooligan, a ridiculous accidental conflict and manslaughter story was made extremely smooth and flawless. Someone must have taught him this. Xiao Wenjing silently looked at the image in the interrogation room through the monitor. She watched as her subordinates used all kinds of methods to intimidate but to no avail. If she investigated from behind this hooligan, even if she investigated more than 70 levels, she was afraid that she wouldn't be able to find the real mastermind. How did the other party pick up the knife and wear the bloody clothes of the real culprit? It was obviously the supplies distributed by the federal military. How did it end up with the hooligan? She found an excellent reason. Of course, there were many loopholes in the entire case, but other than admitting to manslaughter and handing over the bloody clothes, the hooligan kept his mouth shut and didn't say a word. The most serious situation was that since the power behind the real culprit had already made a move, the pressure that should come would naturally come. It definitely wouldn't be as simple as just one person. This was where Xiao Wenjing's worry lay. As expected, he immediately received a call from his superior. In a subtle tone, he was asked to quickly close the murder case at Hushan Road, comfort the victim's family as soon as possible, and give an explanation to the Nutshell Mobile Company. There are loopholes in this case, and there are suspicious points. I have to continue investigating. Xiao Wenjing was unusually stubborn. You can investigate, but shouldn't you release the second lieutenant? If you can find any other evidence in the future, just bring him back, the dignified voice on the other end of the phone said coldly. Xiao Wenjing slowly hung up the phone, and a self-deprecating smile appeared on her face. Previously, when she received the call from her direct superior, she was also under pressure. However, that pressure was from arresting Su Lu and speeding up the investigation. The pressure now was from a completely different direction. Comfort the victim's family? Bullshit. On the morning of the third day after the murder case at Hushan Road, Su Lu walked out of the district prosecutor's office accompanied by the female officer, Su Songzi. Looking at the fresh sunlight, he didn't feel much joy in his heart, only calmness. The Tai family's action was slightly slower than he had expected, but he didn't expect the Tai family to act so quickly and accurately. They helped him eliminate all the evidence of his crime and personally sent a scapegoat to the district prosecutor's office. Just thinking about that scapegoat made Su Lu unable to feel happy. As one of the 7 great families of the Federation, these things naturally didn't need to be done by them personally. Everyone had their own realms, and the competition and killing of those lower powers were very far away from them. They only needed to express their attitude, and naturally, someone would do it. The sunlight was a bit blinding, and a cold and angry voice suddenly sounded beside Su Lu. Can you sleep peacefully at night? Su Lu turned his head and looked at Inspector Xiao Wenjing beside the stone pillar outside the district prosecutor's office. Looking at her haggard expression, he was silent for a while, and then suddenly said, "In the entire Federation, no one sleeps more peacefully than me." Xiao Wenjing was slightly stunned, as if she didn't expect this person to still be able to act so righteously and with a clear conscience at this moment. she said mockingly, including after killing someone. Those who want to kill will naturally be killed, Sula said. Inspector Xiao Wenjing seemed to have caught some information. She narrowed her eyes and said, "Unfortunately, you won't tell the truth. Because I still have a lot of things to do." Sula looked at her and suddenly asked, "Do you think you stand on the side of justice?" "I stand on the side of the law." Then from the very beginning, the district prosecutor's office shouldn't have gotten involved in the Hushan Road case at all. Sula looked at her and said, "Since you couldn't resist this kind of pressure from the very beginning, then you should know very well that what you want is only performance and promotion. It has nothing to do with justice or the law. I'm very sorry to say what's on your mind." Sula turned around and walked towards the black car at the bottom of the stone steps. Behind him, Inspector Xiao Wenjing fell into deep thought after hearing these words. "I don't know the details of this murder case, but I think, no matter what, you can't be considered on the side of justice." Su Songzi, who had been silently following him, suddenly spoke when he saw Xiao Wenjing's somewhat lonely expression and then glanced at Su Li's calm face. "I know you think I'm the murderer." Su Li's hand touched the handle of the black car. Without turning around, he said, "I used to respect the law as well, but later, I discovered through the facts that the Federation's laws are ineffective against certain people, so my respect for the law also faded. I also gradually understood that there is no reason to speak of in this universe. Since that's the case, I can only insist on what I think is right. It has nothing to do with justice." Su Songzi silently looked at his side profile. She clearly knew that he had brutally killed an active Federation officer the night before yesterday, but for some reason, she couldn't link this person to a cold-blooded criminal. She would rather believe that there was more to this matter, but unfortunately, Sula was unwilling to say. "Oh right, the crime of destroying the core secrets of the Federation. Because you have the rights to the laboratory data, additional investigations are being carried out. You will temporarily be placed under residential surveillance and won't be forcibly detained." Su Songzi laughed self-deprecatingly. She thought about how the Federation's laws that she had studied for so many years were actually so weak in front of these invisible existences. She said lightly, "Congratulations, if there are no accidents, you shouldn't be sent to the military court again." Sula softly said thank you to her, then sat in the back seat of the black car. The black car drove away from the busy entrance of the district prosecutor's office. Su Songzi hugged the case file in her arms and quietly watched the black car disappear around the corner. She silently thought to herself, what exactly does this young officer have to attract the attention of so many powers in the Federation government? This definitely isn't just related to Deputy Minister Zhou. After leaving the district prosecutor's office, Sula knew that the Tai family had started to make their move. Since the murder case could be reduced to nothing, then naturally, the problem in the nutshell laboratory could also be suppressed. He didn't know how they did it, but he was thinking about what they wanted him to do next. "Madam is waiting for you." A middle-aged man sat in the driver's seat of the black car. Sula silently looked at his back. For some reason, he thought of Butler Jean. Chapter 196. Not many people in the Federation paid attention to the Hushan Road case because the media did not report on it extensively. Even the independent media of the George faction that was most willing to expose the dark secrets of the Federation was silent on this matter. Logically speaking, under the tens of thousands of years of the First Charter, the rate of criminal cases in the Federation was not high, especially such vicious cases. Moreover, the suspect and the victim were both young officers from the Federation Shell Motor Company. There were too many articles that could be written about this case by the reporters. However, whether it was because the case had happened too recently or the reporters had too little information, or because the district attorney's office had kept a tight lid on the case, the news did not spread widely. Now that a reckless hooligan had confessed, the young second lieutenant involved in the case had left in a relaxed manner, and the Hushan Road case would naturally be gradually forgotten. Similar to this case, many people knew that the Shell Motor Company Research Institute laboratory had been smashed by someone with an axe. For the Federation, the data that could affect the development of the new generation of mecha was obviously much more important than an officer who had just entered the federal military. However, this matter involved the secrets of the Federation, and no news media would touch this red line. Yesterday morning, the laboratory that had been smashed to pieces by Sulu had been completely sealed by the military police. Immediately after, the core data inside had all been transferred. It was not difficult for the Federal Academy of Science to obtain access to the central database. On the surface, the data was still quietly stored in a remote room in the Husk Institute, but Sulu and many people involved in this matter knew very well that the people in the Federal Academy of Science had already obtained the data. Unfortunately, no one had evidence to prove the actions of the Federal Academy of Science, just like how the district attorney's office had no evidence to prove that Sulu had committed murder, or like how Dean Lin of the Federal Academy of Science had plagiarized Professor Shen's research results many years ago. The Free and Fair Federation was indeed just a slogan. Outside the high-amplitude particle laboratory of the Federal Academy of Science and Technology, Secretary Luo was on the phone with someone. He maintained a smile on his face as he responded to the other person's thanks, but his eyes were looking inside the laboratory. After the call ended, Secretary Luo did not rush into the laboratory to report this important call. Instead, he stood quietly by the door and looked at the nervous professors and researchers in the laboratory. The high-amplitude particle laboratory of the Department of Technology was a large-scale laboratory that Dean Lin had applied for a large amount of funds from the Federation Management Committee to build. The department head of this laboratory and the researchers were all very outstanding and capable. Through the filtered glass, Secretary Luo looked at the crowd in Laboratory Area 3. In the middle of the crowd, Dean Lin was sternly scolding something. He knew that the data from the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute had now been quietly transferred here. With the Federal Academy of Science's powerful research and development abilities, it would not take long before the key problems of the Federation's new generation of mecha would be solved. The Federal Academy of Science and Dean Lin, who was in charge of this research, would once again receive the praise and respect of all Federation citizens. As for Professor Shen and that young assistant researcher who had actually created these things, one was already dead, and the other was already marginalized. As long as the final results were out, who would remember the process? Moreover, the other side had already promised that they would definitely not let the young second lieutenant speak carelessly. Secretary Luo frowned slightly, but he did not understand. The other side clearly knew that once the research of the Federal Academy of Science was successful, Dean Lin would personally come to support the election of Governor Ross and Senator Medellin. Why did the other side not seem to care? The noise in the laboratory had come to an end. The leader of the Federation's academic community, Dean Lin, walked out with a serious expression. Secretary Luo followed behind him and said in a low voice, "Secretary Shen called to express his gratitude." Secretary Shen? Wasn't the previous secretary by Madam's side surnamed Jean? Asked Dean Lin with a frown. The new young secretary. Apparently, Madam likes him very much. On the top floor of the Sanlin United Bank headquarters building in the capital, Secretary Lu quietly walked to Li Shouju's side and said softly, "Su Lu has been released." Secretary Shen just called to express his gratitude. Li Shouju quietly looked at the street outside the glass and did not speak for a long time. He did not mind sending that young second lieutenant named Su Lu to prison for life, even if that young man seemed to have a strange relationship with Deputy Minister Zhou of the Ministry of National Defense. However, he had no choice but to let go today. This situation made him feel bad. He could look down on that mysterious young master of the Tai family, but he had to respect the madam of the Tai family. Even if the pride in his bones made him unwilling to let go after receiving the call from Secretary Shen, his father's call from afar extinguished all his courage to challenge the other side. The Crown Prince's friend? Li Shouju laughed. His handsome face was slightly cold. Even Secretary Shen acknowledged this relationship. I have to give this face. It seems that I still underestimated that guy named Su Lu. Macho Mountain was the most secluded mountain forest in the suburbs of the capital. This area of green hills and tranquil gardens was originally the garden of the royal family. During the Third Constitutional Era, it was designated as a national park by the Federation government. District S1 had a large population, so the area of the wildlife reserve that the Federation used electronic walls to encircle was much smaller. However, it still took up half of Macho Mountain. After a few areas were cut, there were not many empty and quiet places. The tourists that came to this mountain only paid attention to the beauty of the mountains and rivers. They had long forgotten the faint royal atmosphere of this mountain park. In the deepest part of Macho Mountain, there was a large area of forest surrounded by fences hidden in the grass and cliffs. The tourists could not see the scenery inside. They only thought that it was an obstacle to prevent the dangers of the mountain road. They did not know that there were thousands of acres of forest inside that belonged to an ancient and mysterious family name in the Federation. The black car steadily followed the mountain road to the end. An inconspicuous iron gate blocked the front. After passing through the iron gate, one could faintly see the depths of the mountain. At the end of the flowing water, there seemed to be a few small buildings that were built in picturesque disorder. It was indescribably beautiful. Sulu pushed open the car door and stood in front of the iron gate. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the small buildings in the distance. Macho Mountain was very close to the capital. This manor hidden in the mountain had such a large area. In addition, he had read a lot of books. After learning about Tai Ziyuan's background, he had crammed in the history of the Federation. He knew that this mountain was originally a royal garden. With the Tai family's status and history in the Federation, it was natural for them to live in this mountain. The iron door slowly opened, and a man in his 30s wearing a dark suit in the late spring came out to greet them with a smile. This person first nodded at Sulu and then said a few words to the driver in the black car. Sulu was slightly surprised. He knew the man in front of him, but he didn't expect that he would appear here. Mr. Wang is the madam's personal driver. He has served the Tai family for many years. The man smiled at Sulu and said, "The madam rarely uses her personal car to pick up people. I think that other than the president and the war god, there shouldn't be many people who can receive this kind of treatment." This kind of subtle expression, coupled with this person's polite and slightly distant smile, was not repulsive. Sulu looked at him with a smile and said, "Shenli." When they met at the base of the Black Eagle Security Company in Linhai, he easily recognized this secretary Shen. "I am the madam's secretary now," Shenli said with a smile. The Black Eagle Security Company was one of the 3 major security companies in the Federation. With Shenli's age, he was able to become a senior manager of the Black Eagle. That day, under the instructions of Tai Ziyuan, he had full authority to command the operation in Linhai. He was already a very impressive person. However, in less than half a year, he actually became the secretary of the Madame Tai. Sulu couldn't help but be a little surprised. Although Tai Ziyuan had already passed the coming-of-age ceremony, which was completed with his help, Sulu knew very well that the real power of the Tai family of the 7 major families in the Federation was still in the hands of the high and mighty Madame. The secretary of the Madame Tai, when put on the stage of the Federation, was enough to talk to a governor as an equal. Compared to the senior manager of the Black Eagle Security Company, this was undoubtedly a big step forward. "Madame Tai is waiting for us." A bicycle slowly came to the side of the two. Secretary Shen smiled and explained, "The madam doesn't like the smell of gasoline, natural gas, and liquid hydrogen mixed with the smell of chemical products, so all the cars in the park are electric bicycles." Sulu nodded and didn't say anything more. He followed Secretary Shen onto the bicycle. The picturesque small buildings at the end of the mountains and rivers seemed to be very far away, but in fact, they were very close. It didn't take long for the electric bicycle to take them to the front of the small building. On the right side of the small building was a long corridor. The corridor was covered with long green vines. The new leaves were like jade, and the yellow flowers were just blooming. Looking through this long corridor, a small dam could be seen not far away. The mountain stream of the back mountain was blocked by this dam many years ago, and a small Xiaoping lake in the mountains was formed. The small building was under the mountain forest, by the lake. Walking along the stone steps towards the deep courtyard, Sula lowered her head slightly, but her ears were listening to the sound of the mountain wind blowing through the forest and the lake rippling. She was not surprised to feel that there were many people hidden in the surrounding forest. She could not see any of the Thai family's security personnel with her eyes, but she could hear and feel that his pair of knife-like straight eyebrows slightly raised. Noticing that he was listening, Secretary Shin's footsteps slowed down slightly and immediately returned to normal. His lips slowly released a smile, and he felt a little surprised by Su Li's attentiveness and ability. The two men walked to the second-floor terrace of the small building deep in the courtyard and naturally stopped. Su Li took a deep breath and made his expression as calm and gentle as possible. Even if he was really a stone, he was still nervous knowing that he was about to meet such a big shot as Madame Tai. There was a parasol on the terrace. Under the parasol, there was a small white table, a few plates of pastries, a pot of tea, and two women. Chapter 197. The most powerful person in the Federation was, of course, President Sieg. The Vice President, the Chairman of the Federation Management Committee, the Director of the Federation Investigation Bureau, the National Security Advisor, and the Director of the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation. These were all important figures who stood beside the President, who stood at the pinnacle of power in the Federation. The chief executives of the various regions, as well as the governors of large states like Ross, were all people of low status. However, the one with the highest prestige in the hearts of the Federation citizens was the old man from the Lees of Philadelphia. Outside of the political structure of the Federation, the 7 great families were hidden in the shadows. However, they possessed sufficient power to stand up against these important figures mentioned above. This was especially true for the Zhong family from the West Woods, who had been stationed at the edge of the universe for generations. They were akin to warlords. The Tai family was the most mysterious and low-key of the 7 great families. All these years, the leader of the Tai family had always been a woman. Ever since she got engaged to the previous head of the Tai family at the Double Moon Festival Ball at Yue University, that woman had been the most powerful woman in the Federation since she was in her 20s. Especially now that the Tai family was gradually stepping into the limelight, the existence of this woman was even more important. Every decision she made could possibly affect the future of the entire Federation. After becoming friends with Tai Ziyuan, Sula learned about the history of the Tai family and their status in the Federation. He had once been curious as to what kind of person this powerful Lady Tai was. After coming to the capital and entering the Nutshell prison, especially after being released from prison for the past 2 days, he had truly felt the terrifying influence that the Tai family had on the Federation. Thus, this curiosity had become even stronger. Sitting in a black car, sitting on an electric scooter, looking at the scenery of the lake and mountains, looking at the ivy-covered corridor, Su Li's mood didn't relax at all. This was because he knew that he was about to meet that woman. He kept guessing in his heart what kind of person Lady Tai should be. No matter how he thought about it, he couldn't figure it out. Until he came to the balcony and saw the woman smiling as she watched Zhou Yu's wrist movements under the parasol, he suddenly understood that Lady Tai should be like this. Because of the passing of youth, she appeared ordinary and peaceful. There was nothing special about her. No matter how the people in the Federation guessed, Lady Tai looked like this, and this woman was Lady Tai. Secretary Shin politely pulled out the chair next to Zhou Yu and gestured for Su Lu to sit down. Then he went to Lady Tai's side and pulled the chair to the back. He sat down quietly and didn't care about the blazing morning sun outside the parasol. He silently rubbed his hands and maintained a suitable distance from the 3 people under the parasol. Su Lu felt that his lumbar vertebrae seemed to be a bit rusty, and the movement of sitting down was somewhat difficult. It was clearly a scene of afternoon tea on the lakeside balcony, but because of the existence of the woman across the table, there was a trace of uneasiness in the atmosphere. This naturally wasn't because the afternoon tea had been moved to the morning, but because of the identity of the woman. This was the smell of power. After taking the teacup handed over by Zhou Yu, Su Lu subconsciously looked over and saw Zhou Yu quietly lowering her head to divide the tea. Every movement was so natural and graceful. Su Lu had seen many sides of this girl, but he never imagined that Zhou Yu would be so pure, so quiet and so virtuous. After Su Lu took his seat, the lady across the table didn't say anything. Instead, she held a small teacup made of guna porcelain and slowly took a sip. She narrowed her eyes and looked at the lake below the terrace, as if she was thinking about something long ago. Su Lu was silent for a moment. He picked up the teacup handed over by Zhou Yu and took a sip. There was no food to eat in the district procuratorate, and he didn't drink much water in the morning. The key was that the air on the balcony had become a bit dry because of the smell of power. His throat was a bit dry and spicy. He finally understood why Zhou Yu was able to expose the political collusion behind the laboratory data the night before. A girl who often drank afternoon tea with Lady Tai, trained under this kind of pressure, shouldn't be a normal person to begin with. But this kind of tea was too depressing. Su Lu lowered his head slightly and put down the teacup. He thought to himself, could it be that Zhou Yu's coldness and craziness outside was because she was too suppressed in front of Lady Tai? In an instant, he thought of Lady Tai's afternoon tea. Many people in the Federation probably wanted to drink it but couldn't. Zhou Yu drank tea with the woman for so many years. She had seen so many people and things. The woman across the table probably really liked Zhou Yu and wanted her to marry Tai Ziyuan. But now, Zhou Yu was an unmarried mother. The child in her belly was growing healthily, and his identity was that of the child's father. Thinking of this, Su Li's mood became a little strange. But then he thought about how Deputy Minister Zhou could see at a glance that he was taking the blame for someone else. The woman in front of him was smart enough to see that as well. Plus, he had called Tai Ziyuan from the very beginning to report this matter. Just as he lowered his head and pondered in silence, Lady Tai had already retracted her gaze from the lake. She smiled and looked at his ordinary face, but still didn't say anything. Su Lu put the teacup on the table and took a deep breath. He raised his head and looked back at her with a smile. His smile wasn't deliberate. It was just like how he used to be in the past. It came from his heart and appeared naturally and optimistically. Lady Tai didn't seem to expect that this young man, who came to see her for the first time, would have the courage to look her in the eyes. A faint glimmer of light flashed across Lady Tai's eyes, and the crow's feet at the corners of her eyes smoothened a lot. Just then, Butler Jean came to the balcony with a pot of coffee and poured a cup for Su Lu. Su Lu was a little surprised. He bowed and nodded in response. "Get a coffee." "This is Caspian caviar," said Lady Tai with a smile. "I heard that you like caviar very much, so I specially prepared some for you today." Su Lu was slightly stunned. He didn't expect this to be the first thing this woman said today. He was very familiar with the aroma of the coffee in the cup and the small plate of black, pearl-like snacks on the table. This was because many nights in the H1 section of the library of Linhai Lihua University, he would often exchange scallion pancakes and plain porridge bought from small stalls for Tai Ziyuan's coffee and pancakes. Lady Tai specially prepared this today because she had heard someone mention it before. Su Lu immediately understood the meaning behind Lady Tai's words. Secretary Shen sent people to bail him out of the district attorney's office not because the Tai family needed Su Lu, but because she valued the friendship between her son and him. Tai Ziyuan doesn't have many friends. "Other than Zhou Yu, you're the only friend I've ever seen," said Lady Tai with a smile. Su Lu took a sip of coffee and ate a piece of caviar to satisfy his hunger. When he heard this, he laughed. He believed that Lady Tai definitely didn't hear it from Tai Ziyuan himself, but from Butler Jean. After all, Tai Ziyuan should know very well that he didn't like this kind of weird-tasting, luxurious biscuit at all. "I heard that you used to be a soldier in Donglin district. When did you enter Yue University?" Drinking tea on the terrace was something that only the upper class of the Federation liked to do. However, different classes of celebrities gave off different vibes. Presumably, there weren't many people in the Federation who had the right to occupy half of the national park and become the backdrop for a tea party. However, no matter what kind of tea they drank, other than a very small number of people who drank alone, it was all a means of communication. What they drank was secondary, what they talked about was more important. Su Lu held his coffee cup and narrowed his eyes. The scenery of the lake and mountains entered his mind. When he heard Lady Tai's question, he answered quietly and politely, "Madam, I entered your university in the winter of the 65th year of the constitutional era." "Oh? Back then, Tai Ziyuan's father and I also studied at your university. How are the flowers in your garden blooming now?" "Very beautiful." Su Lu answered, "I spent most of my time beside the iron gate of your garden. I took a lot of photos. At that time, I lived in the girls' dormitory in Plum Garden." The ordinary-looking Lady Tai spoke normally. She didn't seem to be probing him. This high and mighty head of the 7 great families used the common point of your university to find the rhythm of the conversation. She smiled and chatted idly with Su Lu, diluting the previous atmosphere on the terrace. At this time, Su Lu was a little distracted. Only now did he remember that it had been almost 2 years since he escaped from Donglin district. As for Plum Garden Dormitory, he had once waited for a young girl in the dormitory on a snowy night. The gossip continued. The high and mighty lady across the table didn't deliberately pretend to be approachable. She only looked at Su Lu calmly. The examination in her eyes was completely hidden by the shrewdness she had cultivated for decades. Su Lu also didn't feel like he was bathing in the spring breeze. He knew that the lady across the table wasn't a politician. She didn't need to win the favor of the voters, and she didn't need to maintain a friendly image. Today, he was able to sit on the terrace, basking in the mountain breeze and the lake light. It wasn't because he had the data from the laboratory as his capital, nor was it because he had a good relationship with Tai Ziyuan. It was because the lady across the table wanted to look at him for some reason. After the matter of your university was finished, Lady Tai stood up and left. Zhou Yu followed behind her. She found an opportunity to turn around and sneak a glance at Su Lu. She made a strange expression. Only Su Lu and Secretary Shen were left on the terrace under the parasol. Su Lu knew that the real conversation had just begun. Without the presence of the lady, he felt that the air was suddenly filled with a relaxed atmosphere. The scenery of the lake and mountains began to reveal its true beauty. Secretary Shen smiled at him and asked, "Do you still have the data?" "Yes." "When will you give it to me?" Chapter 198. Raising one's eyebrows didn't mean that he was angry or hostile. Little Lu knew very well that he had no reason to be angry or hostile on the terrace of Macho's back mountain. Thus, he smiled. It was not the kind of smile one would have when one accepted his fate, nor was it the smile he had when he was in front of Lady Tai. He was just smiling. Thus, Secretary Shen also smiled. He personally poured another cup of coffee for Su Lu and then sat back in his chair, quietly waiting for the other's reply. As Lady Tai's secretary, Shen Li understood the style of the 7 major families of the Federation very well. The Iron Schemer was not only referring to this family's meticulous planning, but also to the fact that this family planned before making a move, not leaving any benefits for the opponent. The Iron Schemer and the Federal Academy of Science had worked together, so the Tai family's reaction had been much slower to begin with. Thus, in the end, Secretary Shen did not believe that this young man in front of him had really grasped the data. However, since Madame believed, he could only believe. Su Li's mind was filled with many shocking things, but his personality definitely did not have such elements. After taking a sip of coffee, he raised his head. Previously, Madame Xian had only wanted to take a look at him. Right now, the conversation between her and Secretary Shen was about the actual details. And it was clear that Secretary Shen was a very busy person, and also a very direct person. Thus, he also very directly stated his conditions. "I want to face the mecha directly, and you all can't monitor me." He was not used to this kind of bargaining and scheming conversation, so he had laid out his bottom line right from the start. Secretary Shen frowned slightly, somewhat unexpectedly feeling a trace of possibility from Su Li's tone. From the start, under Madame's instructions, he had helped this young second lieutenant clean up any traces behind him. After that, he had personally made 2 calls to the young master of the Li family and the Federal Academy of Science. However, he had always thought that Madame was just doing a small thing for Su Lu for Tai Ziyuan's sake. Unexpectedly, it seemed that there really was some kind of benefit waiting for the Tai family in front of them. It was unknown what Secretary Shen said on the intercom, but a staff member walked up from the side of the balcony, carrying a large box. The staff member put the big box next to the table, bowed to Secretary Shen, and then quietly left. Secretary Shen placed the box on the table and opened it, then pushed it in front of Su Lu. The pure black keyboard and specialized data input device flashed slightly under the clear light of the lake. Su Lu was slightly stunned. He recognized that this was the Federation's most advanced integrated workbench. He understood why Secretary Shen placed the workbench in front of him. He pressed a button on the side of the workbench, called up the display screen, and then closed his eyes to think for a moment. During the 10 seconds of closing his eyes, Su Lu moved a part of the data model in his mind, once again confirming that the mysterious existence had indeed imprinted the data of the laboratory into his brain. He did not want to think about the mysterious existence, because at this time, there were clouds coming from the east, covering the scorching sun on the peak of Macho Mountain. The cool lake water caused the mountain wind to cool down the temperature. If he thought too much, he was worried that his scalp would go numb and he would feel fear. Opening his eyes, Su Lu began to silently operate the workbench. His 10 fingers moved quickly on the workbench as if he was playing the piano. From time to time, he would use both of his thumbs to operate the specialized data input device. Secretary Shen did not look at the display screen, but only stared at Su Li's eyes and the pair of fast-moving hands. 23 minutes later, Su Lu somewhat tiredly retracted his hands. He rubbed his eyes, turned the workbench in the box, and pushed it in front of Secretary Shen. Secretary Shen quickly glanced at the complex data model on the display screen and did not look at it again. He smiled at him and said, "Take a break first." Everyone had their own field of expertise. The first military academy had nurtured many outstanding talents in the Federation for countless years, such as Shi Qinghai, Zhou Yu, and Shen Li. To be able to become Lady Tai's secretary, Shen Li was naturally an all-rounder. However, when it came to data models in the Federation's most advanced field of technology, he admitted that he was much inferior to Su Lu. This workbench should be connected to a certain extent. The Tai family had specialized technicians analyzing the meaning of this data model, Su Lu thought. A few minutes later, Secretary Shen slightly closed his eyes, as if he was listening to the sound of the communication device in his ear. A moment later, he slowly raised his head. However, the gaze he used to look at Su Lu now was much more formal, much more serious. "It is very difficult for me to agree to your conditions just now," Secretary Shen said sincerely. "The development of the new generation of mecha in the Federation is a systematic project. Even if you have mastered the most critical technology, you cannot complete this project alone. This will require the cooperation of at least 1,000 engineers." Su Lu listened quietly, his eyes fixed on the layer of white foam swirling gently in his coffee cup. No one knew what he was thinking. "I need a MX prototype mecha for research. Professor Shen's name must be on the Federation's list of manufacturers of the new generation of mecha." Su Lu lowered his head, looked at the coffee cup, and said, "I did not hesitate to kill and set fire to the data in the laboratory. This is all for this. Why must you participate in this process? Other than the government, or in other words, the Shell Motor Company, no one else in this world can provide these industrial foundations." Secretary Shen stared into his eyes and said coldly, "The Tai family may be able to, but the Tai family has done so much for you without any benefits. This agreement is very difficult to reach. No matter how good your personal relationship with the young master is, it is still the same. I admit that I cannot change anything by myself. The development of mecha does indeed require the large industrial foundations you speak of, so if you want to compete with the Federal Academy of Science for time, I need to stay at the Shell Motor Company to watch closely." Su Lu raised his head and said, "As for the issue of benefits you mentioned, since the success of the new generation of mecha in the Federation will affect the presidential election, then I think that from Madame's point of view, it does not matter who develops the new generation of mecha, as long as it is not Dean Lin. The Tai family does not need the false reputation of developing the new generation of mecha. They only need someone else to succeed before them. Su Lu looked at Secretary Shen's thoughtful face and continued, but my teacher really needs this false reputation. To be precise, other than the false reputation behind him, he can no longer enjoy anything else. Secretary Shen did not speak for a long time. He was probably calculating in his mind. Lady Tai had given him a lot of authority, but he had to weigh the pros and cons. Professor Shen's signature. I can promise you, and I can tell you clearly that if you give me the data, the Shell Motor Company will still be the one to carry out the specific research work, Secretary Shen said calmly. We have a certain amount of influence over the Shell Motor Company. Coincidentally, the Shell Motor Company does not have anything to do with the Federal Academy of Science. In the past, Su Lu would have been shocked when Secretary Shen said that he could influence the Shell Motor Company. However, facing the terrifying power of the 7 major families of the Federation, he was already numb to it. He only said softly, the data must be in my hands. In that case, can I go directly to the Shell Motor Company? Can you not go to the Shell Motor Company? Secretary Shen suddenly said, how about this? I'll arrange for you to go to the Whitewater Company. As for the data, I'll set up a direct channel. You can contact the people in the Shell Motor Company directly. The development of a new epic-making mecha for the Federation was a great honor, and naturally also a great benefit. If Secretary Shen agreed to all of Su Li's requests, the Tai family would not be able to gain any advantage. However, for some reason, Secretary Shen suddenly gave in. Whitewater Company. Su Lu suddenly remembered that the first test of the prototype MX mecha for the Federation seemed to have taken place at this Shell Motor Company. However, the problem was that the Tai family's strength should be at Black Eagle. Why would they send him to Whitewater? These past few days, you've caused too much of a ruckus in the research institute. In addition to the incident at Hushan Road, who knows how many pairs of eyes will be watching you. It's not suitable for you to stay in the Shell Motor Company's headquarters any longer, Secretary Shen said. The only place that can meet your requirements is the Whitewater Company, said Secretary Shen. The Shell Motor Company is definitely out of the question. If you appear in the Shell Motor Company, both the Li family and the Academy of Science will be wary. Su Lu was silent for a long time before nodding. Secretary Shen smiled and closed the black workbench in front of him. He stood up and shook hands with Li Du. When their hands touched, it meant that the agreement between the two parties had been reached. Su Lu did not express his gratitude to Secretary Shen for saving him from the district attorney's office. Secretary Shen also did not represent Lady Tai to express her gratitude to Su Lu for his performance at the Linhai State Gymnasium. Those matters were on another level. Secretary Shen suddenly looked at him and asked, I'm very curious about something. I heard that half a year ago, the Crown Prince personally invited you to join the Tai family. You never agreed. Why are you willing to cooperate with us this time? If I join the Tai family, I will be Tai Ziyuan's subordinate, Su Lu said with a smile. Cooperation is equal. Secretary Shen's smile became somewhat profound. This young man in front of him actually wanted to cooperate with the Tai family on an equal footing. What kind of arrogant and presumptuous thought was this? However, there was not a single trace of arrogance in the other party's honest expression. There was only a trace of absurd sincerity. Beside the window on the top floor of the small building facing the lake, Lady Tai silently looked at the lines of the lake. The lines at the corners of her eyes were like the things she had experienced over the years. They gradually accumulated and could not be undone. She quietly listened to the voices beside her. She did not miss any of the words that Secretary Shen and Su Lu said. When she heard the word cooperation, she could not help but smile. She could hear that Su Lu was not used to this kind of bargaining. She could also hear that this young man was immature and stubborn. She did not dislike this point. Instead, she felt that it was somewhat interesting. The metal in her hand was slightly cold. Lady Tai lowered her head and looked at the small tool in her hand. This was the small blue device that Su Lu had left behind in the Nutshell laboratory. Since the beginning, the Tai family's influence in the Federation had been secretly cleaning up for him under the instructions of this madam. They naturally did not leave behind this device. Chapter 199. Su Lo entered Yue University with Professor Jin's recommendation letter, but it seems like he doesn't know this himself. Butler Jin stood beside Lady Tai, like a pine tree by the lake, hidden in the mountains and rivers, undetectable. He said apologetically in a low voice, "About this, I've known about it for a long time, but because young master insisted on not informing you, so he did not finish his sentence." Lady Tai looked out of the window quietly, her hand slowly caressing the small device that emitted blue light. In the entire Federation, she was probably the only one who could see the wisdom hidden within this small device, as well as the man behind this wisdom. Seeing that Madame did not say anything, Butler Jean took a step back and stood in the shadows by the window. He was very clear about the story between the Tai family and Professor Jean. Although he did not know Professor Jin's true identity, he had served this family for so long that he could feel some of Madame's emotions. "Send someone to Donglin to investigate the incident that happened in the year 65, Lady Tai said softly. "This is too much of a coincidence." Butler Jean did not know what coincidence was, and Lady Tai did not mention it either. Today, only President Sieg, herself, and a few people in the Lees of Philadelphia knew the true identity of the defected mechanic, Yufeng. And because of some of the stories from back then, she knew more about that person's identity than anyone else. From the beginning, Lady Tai did not believe that person would die so quietly. Now, she held the device that only he could make in her hands. Looking through the window at the young man he had recommended to Yue University, her heart gradually calmed, and she felt indescribably calm. The black metal door slowly closed behind the car. Su Lo sat in the black car, his eyes narrowed, as if his thoughts were still stuck in the beautiful scenery of the lake and mountains behind Macho Mountain. Today, the wealth displayed by the Tai family did not have the aura of wealth, only the aura of mountains and mountains. The mountains and mountains were picturesque, and this painting seemed to be in the heart of that madam. Su Lo was clear that after he came out from Macho Back Mountain, his life would be different again. However, he still stubbornly believed that he was only a small character, a commoner. Facing that picturesque landscape, he didn't feel the slightest bit moved, nor did he feel inferior. He only felt a slight pressure. The black car on the mountain road smoothly avoided the increasing number of tourists in the front mountain. Su Li's hands were firmly on the steering wheel. This car was the one he used to drive. Since the district prosecutor's office had already found him innocent, this black car naturally didn't need to stay in the forensics department anymore. Secretary Shen had already taken it out for him. "Thank you." He suddenly smiled and turned to speak to Zhou Yu. When he left the back mountain of Macho, out of his expectation, Zhou Yu also left the mountain with him. He knew very well that after he sent Zhou Yu to the West Mountain compound of the Ministry of National Defense 2 nights ago, this girl must have told the whole thing to Madame Tai in the first instant. Su Le didn't know that Lady Tai had already begun to suspect the relationship between him and that uncle. He only thought that if this girl beside him didn't help to analyze the situation and ask the Tai family to help at the first moment, then his life would be very difficult. He might really become a fugitive in the Federation again. Zhou Yu laughed self-deprecatingly, her hand gently stroking her belly. Her belly was already very big now. She was gradually approaching the life of a young unmarried mother. Her face without makeup looked slightly haggard and nervous. Her feet were a bit swollen, and she wore a pair of loose cloth shoes. Her entire person didn't have the slightest trace of coldness, only a trace of frustration in the tranquility. She slowly turned her head and looked at Su Li's smiling face. She couldn't help but tilt her head and wonder in her heart, what exactly is this guy's nerves made of? It's the first time you've seen Madame, but you can still be so calm. Su Lu, you've surprised me again, Zhou Yu said. Su Lu was silent for a moment, then said with a smile, I'm just pretending. Zhou Yu also smiled. Su Lu didn't say anything else, and focused on driving. On the mountain road, the black car's autopilot wasn't enough to be completely trusted. His gaze calmly stared at the winding mountain road, but in his heart, he was thinking about something else. He knew very well what kind of colossal power the Tai family was. In front of this family, no one could hope for the possibility of equal cooperation, even if he now had the only set of laboratory data in the Federation. However, Secretary Shen had nodded earlier, and the Tai family had even given up most of the benefits. This made him a bit confused. Earlier, when he was bargaining on the balcony, he had only clumsily put forward his own demands, but he didn't expect the other party to agree. Why was this? Late at night in the suburbs of the capital, the black car was like a ghost parked in the parking lot of Linyuan. After returning from Macho Mountain, Su Lu and Zhou Yu were led by the waiter into the restaurant. They had just returned from Shanshui and entered Shanshui again. In the afternoon, Zhou Yu had even invited Su Lu to walk around the famous scenic spots in the capital. He didn't know why Zhou Yu, with her swollen abdomen and swollen feet, had such a great interest in traveling and appetite. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the private jet that occasionally landed under the white cliff behind Linyuan, but in his heart, he thought of George Carlin's theories. George Carlin had always believed that the core of the unfairness of the Federation was that confidence was not made public. This was the so-called principle of class information asymmetry. Linyuan was originally the exclusive restaurant of the HTD Bureau of the Federation. Later, it was purchased by the Lin family, one of the 7 families of the Federation, with a large amount of money. The HTD Bureau was specifically responsible for enforcing the Wildlife Protection Act, and in the upper circle of the Federation, this restaurant was famous for its exquisite wild meat. The people of the Federation didn't know about Linyuan. Even if they had heard some rumors, they didn't know the specific details. In the Federation, as George Carlin had said, from the very beginning, there was no fairness between classes because of the asymmetry of information. Stepping into Linyuan again, was he no longer the orphan of Donglin, the fugitive of the Federation? Su Lu held Zhou Yu's hand and walked inside, but he felt a little lonely and lost. Madman Li has returned to Feicheng. You don't have to worry about anything anymore. Zhou Yu had lived in the 3rd military region since she was a child, and her family was not ordinary. Naturally, she didn't know how Su Lu felt at this moment, so she said with a smile. Beside the floor-to-ceiling window, there was a stream of water that flowed from the depths of the bamboo forest behind the table. Sitting quietly beside the stream, sipping the plum wine in the brown-red clay cup, smelling the delicate fragrance of the bamboo leaves in the water, and looking at the white cliff under the lights in the distance through the window, it was a great enjoyment. Similar to the first time they entered Linyuan, when the two of them walked into the hall, those hidden behind the mangroves, bamboo forests, and pear trees all looked at them seriously and curiously. Surrounded by these gazes, Zhou Yu didn't feel uncomfortable at all. Instead, Su Li's expression became more serious. Sitting in the bamboo house with the best seats, it didn't take long for people to come over and greet them. Those were the people with good eyesight in the capital. They gently said something to Zhou Yu and asked her to say hello to Deputy Minister Zhou. In the end, they politely nodded to Su Lu and left. This happened 4 or 5 times. No matter how slow Su Lu was, he still felt that something was wrong. After a moment of silence, she confirmed that no one would disturb her meal. Perhaps the remaining guests in the Lin garden didn't have the status to come to their table. Only then did Su Lu let out a sigh of relief. Zhou Yu used the tip of her chopsticks to pick up a piece of stewed jade bamboo shoot. Looking at him, who was a little uncomfortable, she said with slight ridicule, "It's different from last time. These gazes are all on you. Those people who came over didn't come to see me, but to see you." The news spread so fast. Su Lu bent one leg and held a small wine cup in his hand. At this time, there was no one to disturb him, so his movements were much more casual. However, this posture was a little out of tune with the extremely elegant scenery around them. The news he was talking about was naturally about Secretary Shen calling a young second lieutenant in the Husk Institute. Only such news could make those people come over to talk to Zhou Yu. Their real purpose was just to see what kind of person that young second lieutenant was. There is no absolute secret in the Federation, especially when some people don't want to keep it a secret. Zhou Yu shook her head. Madam asked you to bring me to Linyuan. Su Lu raised his head and looked at Zhou Yu. Are you not used to it? You should know very well that everything is based on rules. Just like the Hushan Road case and the Research Institute case. You can find loopholes, but no one will directly go against the Federation's laws. Zhou Yu looked at him and said, you can't find loopholes, but you can't leave any loopholes. The style of doing things in this circle will never be too violent or direct, and they definitely won't use an axe to smash things. Looking at Su Lu, who was deep in thought and had a hint of conflict between his straight eyebrows, Zhou Yu was silent for a moment before she said quietly, I know what kind of person you are. You really don't belong here, but since you chose to come here, you have to do things according to the rules. She picked up a piece of bamboo leaf that was half green and half yellow from the flowing water beside her and quietly looked at the lines on the bamboo leaf. She didn't know if it was because she was thinking about her own life or something else, but her voice became a little lighter. Not to mention the capital, Harbor City, or other big cities in the Federation, there are many private clubs that are quieter and more luxurious than this place. However, those are all places for private gatherings. Only Linyuan is a place where one can express one's attitude. She placed the bamboo leaf on the table and said, when the bamboo leaf falls on the ground, it will be swept away and sent to the landfill to be buried. If it falls into the water, it will drift with the waves for a while. Eventually, you will be able to see the scenery that we are seeing right now. Su Lu turned his head and looked at the scenery outside the window through the glass. He opened his mouth and said, it's a pity that there is no wind. It's not refreshing enough. The scenery here is not lively. He thought of the mines in the Donglin district. He and the uncle had eaten wild beef and held glasses of red wine. They had watched the red sunset in the dusky air and fall on the green grassland. That kind of enjoyment was much better than this Linyuan. Su Lu. A somewhat surprised and pleasantly surprised voice rang out. A young officer had passed through the bamboo forest and walked to the side of the table. Su Lu was slightly startled. He didn't understand why Zhou Yu would suddenly appear here. Suddenly, he remembered that Zhou Yu was currently in the Nutshell Engineering Department. His heart jumped, and he turned to look. Zhou Yu had her head tilted and was calmly drinking something. In an instant, he understood that this was not a coincidence. He couldn't help but sigh at Secretary Shen's quick and careful arrangements. Chapter 200. Although Linyuan was good, it was not something that Su Lu could get used to. Even after entering Linyuan, he still could not get used to it. Those people who had come to greet him earlier had made it impossible for him to sit down. Now that he had suddenly met Zhou Yu, although he knew that the other must have come with some sort of motive, for some reason, Su Lu felt his mood become much more relaxed when he looked at this young officer who was not more than 2 years older than himself. The first time he had met Zhou Yu was in the mecha combat room of Yue University's comprehensive gymnasium. The confrontation between the black mecha and the silver M37, the conversation amidst the smoke, these memories were all engraved in Su Li's mind. During that mecha combat, Zhou Yu's extremely graceful performance had left him with a very good impression. He vaguely felt that Zhou Yu already knew that he was the one inside that prototype mecha that had walked away with its belly full, but since the other had never directly asked, he did not admit anything either. Tai Ziyuan hid, Shi Qinghai hid, and Su Lu fled. Other than the unmarried mother beside him, Su Lu was a lonely mess in the capital ring. If it was said that lonely people were shameful, then Su Lu was unquestionably so shameful that he was hated by both men and gods alike. He was a young man, so he naturally had the mental need to interact with others. In addition, he had always had a good impression of Zhou Yu, so after the recruitment exam at the beginning of spring, although the two of them had not seen each other again, they had still spoken on the phone a few times. Su Lu moved away from the seat beside him and poured a full glass of wine for Zhou Yu. A mechanic was like a chief surgeon, what they needed the most was the stability of their hands. He was a very self-disciplined person, so he had rarely drunk alcohol these past few years. However, in the past 2 years, under the influence of Mr. Shi, other than the Sanchi brand cigarettes, he had also developed a hobby of drinking. Fortunately, although the color of the plum wine was thick, its actual alcohol content was not high. Zhou Yu sat beside Su Lu and bowed his head slightly to Zhou Yu, who was sitting across the table. However, it was as if Zhou Yu did not see him. She looked coldly out the window at the white cliff in the distance. From the bottom of her heart, the young miss of the Zhou family was still that cold and arrogant eldest miss. Her gentleness in front of Lady Tai was trained. Her calmness in front of Su Lu was forcefully ground out by the stones in Dong Linyuan. Today, she had brought Su Lu into Linyuan to arrange a coincidental meeting between him and Zhou Yu. As for Zhou Yu herself, she had no interest at all. Su Lu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the wine in his cup. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that Zhou Yu did not have any reaction. He only smiled warmly as he sat down and raised his cup. Just like his name, he was indeed as gentle as jade. It was just that jade also had a soul, it was just that he didn't have a chance to show it for the time being. I really didn't expect you to come, and so quickly. Su Lu shook his head and drank all of the wine in his cup. Zhou Yu brought the red clay cup to his lips and raised his wrist slightly. The rim of the cup did not leave his lips. He appeared to be very gentle, but in reality, he quickly drank all of the wine in the cup. He placed the cup down at the same time as Su Li's hand. I also didn't expect you to cause so much trouble in just a few months after entering the research institute. Zhou Yu finished the wine in his cup and placed his military cap on the table beside him. He turned his body slightly and looked at Su Lu calmly. You should understand why I'm here. At this moment, there were 3 people by the bamboo table beside the flowing water. Zhou Yu was a girl that Lady Tai had taught single-handedly. In addition to her family, Su Lu did not need to avoid her when talking with Zhou Yu. Su Li's fingers gently gripped the wine cup as he sank into deep thought. When he saw Zhou Yu arrive, he knew what Secretary Shen planned to do next. He didn't need to know what kind of agreement Secretary Shen, the Li family, and the Federal Academy of Science had reached in order to smoothly get him out of prison. He only knew that he could no longer stay in the Husk Institute. If he wanted to turn the data in his brain into a real new generation of mecha, it would require the hard work of many people. Under the pressure of the other party, Su Lu was about to be transferred out of the Nutshell headquarters and sent to the Baigong Security Company under the Shell Motor Company. His data would be sent to the Shell Motor Corporation Engineering Department, and this required a channel. Although the Li family and the Federal Academy of Science no longer cared about him, the other party would definitely keep an eye on Su Lu. If Su Lu was directly sent to the Nutshell Engineering Department, it would definitely arouse the suspicions of those people. In order to compete with the Federal Academy of Science for time, this sort of suspicion had to be eliminated. Coincidentally, the personal relationship between Su Lu and Zhou Yu that could be confirmed became a natural disguise. Let's keep in touch in the future. Su Lu raised his wine cup and looked at Zhou Yu sincerely. Although it wasn't until tonight that he found out that Zhou Yu was also someone that the Tai family could influence, he couldn't help but be shocked by the Tai family's control over human affairs. However, his intuition told him that Zhou Yu was someone worth interacting with, so his attitude was very sincere. Zhou Yu downed the wine in his cup once more and said with a smile, "Last time, when I sparred with you at your university, I thought that your talent in mecha operation was astonishing. But I really didn't expect that you would actually be able to influence the development of new mecha for the Federation. You have brought me too many surprises, so please don't worry, I will cooperate with you very well." Being directly reminded of the past by Zhou Yu, thinking back to the battle between the two mecha at Yale University, Su Lu looked into Zhou Yu's eyes and couldn't help but laugh self-deprecatingly. There was no such thing as mutual admiration between heroes, the two of them had just found that they were somewhat compatible. I'm currently in the engineering department's office. Anda has been specially recruited to be a mecha test pilot. Zhou Yu put down his wine cup and turned to look at Su Lu. After a long silence, he said, "In the end, it's still you from Donglin who's developed the fastest." Su Lu didn't say anything, pouring him another cup of wine. At the same time, he filled his own red clay wine cup and raised it. The bamboo leaves of the bamboo house fell into the meandering stream. The three of them drank in silence by the window. Zhou Yu observed Su Lu but found that he couldn't quite understand this person. He was born in the West Woods region, which was at the forefront of the battle between the Federation and the Empire. The people of the West Woods were mostly bathed in blood and fire. Their temperaments were valiant and ruthless, and they had a spirit that would rather break than bend. Although Zhou Yu's expression was gentle and amiable like a gentleman, deep in his heart, there was still a trace of unwillingness to fall behind others. Tonight, when he saw Su Lu and Lin Yuan, Zhou Yu knew that even if he didn't want to, he had to. Perhaps it was luck. This person from Donglin had first met Tai Ziyuan, then met Professor Shen. He had grasped the Federation's most important and confidential data, and had even received the strong support of the Tai family. Just based on these points alone, he had already left Zhou Yu in the dust. Zhou Yu drank his wine in silence. Before coming to Lin Yuan, he had already learned all the details of the entire incident from Secretary Shen. He understood that Su Lu didn't rely on luck. Whether it was the gleaming blade at Hushan Road, the axe marks at the Research Institute, or the baiting or forcing of the Tai family in the end, there was no place that didn't reveal this young man's stubbornness. Stubbornness was an excellent or troublesome quality, but when it was taken to the extreme, it would become exceptionally terrifying. Just like at this moment, the scenery in Linyuan was beautiful. There was no music to annoy the ears, but there was running water that could calm the heart. The people eating and chatting, or rather, the people, wore simple but expensive clothes that fit their bodies. Their movements were elegant and quiet. Only Su Lu, who was beside him, wore a casual shirt of unknown brand that probably didn't cost much. It had a lot of wrinkles on it. He just sat like this in Lin Yuan's most expensive bamboo house cubicle. He sat with one leg bent, the hand that was holding the wine glass on his knee, and his head slightly lowered. He looked very much like those unemployed people on the streets in movies. What Zhou Yu didn't know was that Su Lu was originally an orphan from a mining family in Donglin. In the past, before they met that uncle, what he and Li Wei were most used to doing was sitting with their legs crossed on the sidewalk of Zhonglo Street and watching the TV screen in the cafe. This was a posture of thinking, and Su Lu was indeed thinking. Since he was very young, he was used to thinking in silence. In his opinion, if people didn't think, they were no different from the bison that only knew how to lower its head and eat grass outside the electronic fence. He was thinking about Lin Yuan, the delicious food on the table, the scenery outside the window, and the future. He thought very clearly, so when he bent his leg and held the wine glass, he vaguely became that orphan on the streets of the past. No one had entered Wang Du's fuming apartment. The surveillance equipment installed around the building confirmed that it was safe. Zhou Yu's expected delivery date was at the end of July, and she had already moved back to the Shishan courtyard. Presumably, the faint knife marks on her face and her impossibly large belly could sever the last hope of the Minister of Defense's family. As for whether Lady Tai had spoken during the Zhou family's reconciliation, Su Lu wasn't sure. It was just that he wasn't used to the fact that there was suddenly one less person in the room, so he buried his head and slept. When he woke up, he began to take big bites of the ready-to-eat lunch box that had been automatically reheated. For 3 whole days, his life consisted of sleeping and eating. He only walked out of the apartment and returned to the Research Institute after he had replenished all the energy and mental energy that he had expended. Many of the Husk Institute staff had seen Su Lu smash the laboratory into pieces with their own eyes. There were also some people with backgrounds who knew that he was involved in the death of an active duty officer in the Ministry of Engineering. When they saw him walk into the Research Institute like nothing had happened, their eyes suddenly became extremely shocked. The director of the 3rd Department of the Research Institute personally wrote an electronic recommendation letter for Su Lu. He was sure that he hadn't done anything wrong in the past few days. The young second lieutenant in front of him really did have a close relationship with Deputy Minister Zhou. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to stay in the Shell Motor Company after causing such a big mess. After Su Lu received the recommendation letter, he refused the enthusiastic director's request to personally deliver it to the Whitewater Security Company. He drove himself to the address on the letter. The black car once again drove past Hawking Avenue, where the Ministry of Finance was located. It drove past the dead end that led to the Bureau of Proclamation. The corners of his eyes twitched slightly, and he forced himself not to think about the omnipotent charter computer at the end of the road. At this moment, the phone rang. The sound of the seventh young master of the Li family, Li Xiaodong's extremely hearty laughter could be heard. "I heard that you have been assigned to the Whitewater Company." Su Lu was slightly surprised. He didn't expect that after the night at the Ivy Garden, this person would actually take the initiative to contact him. He believed that he didn't have anything that the other party needed. Both the Li family and the Federal Academy of Science had already confirmed that the core data was in their hands. "Yes, I'll report right now," Su Lu replied. The other end of the phone was silent for a moment. Then the voice said, "Can you do me the honor of coming out for dinner tonight?" Su Lu subconsciously looked at the weather outside the window. He confirmed that the sun's orbit today was normal. Perhaps the silence made Li Xiaotong a little uncomfortable. He said very seriously, "I don't mean anything else. I just want to hang out with you." Chapter 201. White clouds floated on the mountainside in the distance. The dark green fields stretched as far as the eye could see. The precision irrigation equipment of the Federation's automated farm was spraying morning dew under the sun. From time to time, a faint buzzing sound could be heard. It was in perfect harmony with the chirping of the insects in the forest beside the road. The capital special district's traffic was very developed. After driving for 40 minutes along the highway, the solemn buildings of the capital were no longer in sight. The smell of power was also gone. As far as the eye could see, there was only verdant greenery and the wonderful smell of juice from the broken stems. Just beside the Federation's automated farm, high walls and iron fences separated a large area. From the road, one could only see a 5-story building in the courtyard. Other than that, there were no other eye-catching buildings. The window of the black car rolled down. Su Lu showed the electronic recommendation letter to the guard. With a beep, the door slowly opened. He narrowed his eyes and looked at everything around the car. He was a little surprised. The Federation's largest security company, Whitewater Security Company, was located in the capital special district. It looked quiet with a sense of decline. It didn't look like a company famous for the Federation's high-end weapons. Instead, it looked like a forgotten farm amusement park. Where there was metal, there would be fruit shells. The Shell Motor Company was a giant company in the Federation. The number of people who directly or indirectly served it exceeded 1 million. This company had countless branches, and its business scope involved all aspects of the Federation's social life. Whitewater Security Company was one of them. Because of the disturbance in the research institute, Su Lu was sent to Whitewater Security Company. Before he came, he did some research and found out that this was the Federation's largest security company. Although the Shell Motor Company didn't pay much attention to them, in terms of strength, they were the strongest among the Federation's 3 largest security companies. The Federation had a lot of military operations in the universe. Because of the diplomatic pressure from the Empire and the 100 Mu Triangle, it was inconvenient to mobilize the military. Plus, there were some conflicts with firepower on resource planets, or some secret operations that could not see the light of day. Most of the time, it was the 3 major security companies of the Federation that carried out these operations in place of the federal military. And Whitewater, which was directly under the Shell Motor Company, because of the thick federal military color of its shell, became the main operator. Of course, these were all things that couldn't be seen in the news, but those who knew the inside story knew very well that the Whitewater Security Company was actually a group of mercenaries disguised as mercenaries, or rather, the Federation's thugs disguised as mercenaries. In addition to some security work within the Federation, most of the company's business scope was actually in the borderlands of the Federation. There was even a rumor that after the firefight between District S2 and the anti-government forces had stopped, the company was also secretly involved in the small armed forces that carried out the surprise attack. Therefore, Su was a little surprised when he saw the base that looked like a simple factory. From the outside, the headquarters of the Whitewater Security Company didn't have a trace of military color. After the personnel department reported in, an affairs officer wearing glasses coldly led Su to an office at the back of the building and said to him, "This is your office. In a moment, your secretary will come over to give you the details of your work." What happened in the Capital Special District didn't spread to the Whitewater Security Company, so the people in the headquarters didn't care at all about the arrival of a young second lieutenant. The affairs officer in the personnel department didn't think that Su had any background. In his opinion, being sent to the Whitewater Security Company from the Husk Institute meant that he was definitely a loser in the struggle, and a complete failure. However, the Shell Motor Company's first-order department after all, while the Whitewater Security Company was only a third-order department. Su had such a resume, so even though he was banished here, he was still assigned the position of technical supervisor and even a secretary. The affairs officer looked at Su expressionlessly and asked, "Is there anything else?" The combat personnel of the Whitewater Company were extremely outstanding, and the base was also very well equipped. Many of the combat personnel were even military personnel themselves. These combat personnel on the front lines were well paid and had a promising future. However, the affairs officers and technical supervisors were all pitiful people who were pushed out of the core area of the Shell Motor Company. The affairs officer was the same, but he didn't have the slightest bit of sympathy for Su, who was also a loser. "No, thank you," Su said, turning on the computer screen. Su squinted his eyes and looked at the organization structure of the Whitewater Company. For a moment, he fell into silence. The Whitewater Company was established 24 constitutional years ago. The current CEO, Garay, was once the commander of the Federation's Special Mecha Forces before he retired. According to rumors, after his term at the Whitewater Company ended, he might directly return to the Ministry of Defense to be the commander of the Operations Department. The structure of this company was very strange. Important people like the CEO and the head of training, as well as the basic combat personnel, all had extremely bright futures. However, people like Su Lee's current role, technical supervisors and affairs officers, seemed to be forever stuck in the shadow of the Federation. They carried out those dark missions for the righteous Federation government, but they didn't receive any military medals or rewards. However, this had nothing to do with Su. He was assigned to the Whitewater Company because of the consequences of his actions in the experiment. In order to appease the displeasure of the board of directors and the unrest in the research institute, even the Tai family could only do this much. Su never thought that he would go to a border resource planet to suppress the natives on behalf of the government, nor did he think about disguising himself as a militant and going to District S2 to destroy the anti-government military's resource base. He only needed to sit down in the technical supervisor position of this department, repair some mechanical equipment required by combat personnel, and live out this period of time peacefully. Until the Federation's new generation of MX-type mecha was successfully developed, it looked like he would have to spend his life in this company. Thinking of this, Su narrowed his eyes and looked around his office. This was the first time in his life that he had an independent office that would not be disturbed by others. The problem was that although this office was very luxurious, other than a computer and some furniture, there was nothing else. The company has 5 subsidiaries under its jurisdiction: the training center, the shooting range, the weapons experiment department, the space guard, and the security consultant. Clients include the Ministry of Defense, the Police General Administration, and the HTD Bureau. We also accept requests from outside the STAR system, as long as these requests do not violate the Federation's laws. Our 7th team's main business is in the security consultant area. Su lowered his head and listened to the secretary's report. To be honest, when he first heard that there was a secretary, a strange feeling arose in the young man's heart. He secretly prayed that the company would not give him a middle-aged woman with a lifeless aura. When this secretary named by Yulan walked into the office and began to introduce the Whitewater Company's situation according to the script, Su could not help but sigh softly. The name, female secretary, was a bit vulgar, but the wonderful thing was that this secretary was not a middle-aged woman, nor was she a young and attractive girl who had just graduated. Because the person who came in was not a female secretary at all, the secretary, by Yulan, was 173 meters tall. His facial features were gentle and soft, and his eyes were calm. He stood quietly in front of Su Le like a girl, but the problem was that he was not a woman, so this kind of aura was a bit strange. Su Le narrowed his eyes and looked at him. From this strange aura, he caught a hint of danger. Su Le's ability to recognize people was very strong. He had the keen intuition of an animal. If it were not for the fact that Secretary Bai stood in front of him like a serene young girl and did not show any hostility, perhaps he would have felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Only people who had killed many people and did not take human life seriously would show this kind of aura. In the past years, Su Le had seen many powerful people, such as Captain Tian, Madman Li, and Brother Zheng, who was beside the seventh young master of the Li family. The secretary in front of him, Bai Yulan, was different from these people. He restrained himself very well, but he always gave people the feeling that he would go crazy in the next moment. The calm and gentle expression on his face would turn into a bone-chilling coldness in an instant. When Su Le was looking at Secretary Bai's eyes were looking at the booklet in his hand. His heart was calm, so his appearance was calm. Although he did not welcome a young second lieutenant sent by the research institute to be the technical supervisor of his group, he did not show the slightest expression. He just calmly and indifferently did what he was supposed to do. After being in the military for many years, Bai Yulan was used to seeing death and blood. He did not see this young and ordinary guy in front of him. What is the work of our group? Su Le noticed that Secretary Bai's hands were as white as jade and very delicate. Reporting to the technical supervisor, Team 7 does not have any work arrangements this year, Secretary Bai replied politely. Su Le was not used to the title of technical supervisor. Whitewater Company was a subsidiary of the Shell Motor Company. In addition to carrying out those dangerous missions, the most important work was to cooperate with the Federation to experiment with new weapons and equipment. Therefore, within Whitewater Company, the technical supervisor had more power than other security companies. Su Le was the technical supervisor of Team 7, which was why this delicate Bai Yulan was his secretary. Since Team 7's main work was in the field of security consulting, they definitely would not be stationed on a border planet. However, they also did not have the opportunity to come into contact with those few failed MX prototype mecha. A faint feeling of disappointment grew in his heart. Half of year 67 of the constitutional calendar had passed, and Team 7 of Whitewater Company's security consulting department still had not carried out any missions. Su Le felt that it was a little strange. Although the Federation had always maintained good law and order, the rich and powerful had always attached great importance to their own security. With Whitewater Company's reputation in the industry, it should not have been possible for Team 7 to not have any business for an entire year. He looked at Bai Yulan's delicate hands and was somewhat lost in thought. Chapter 202. There were many apartment buildings on the 13th Avenue of the Capital Special District. Outside the gate of the high-end apartments, which were shrouded in orange lights, taxis stopped and left. Ladies holding flowers walked in and out of the apartments with lonely expressions. Along the streets, middle-aged men could be seen hurriedly walking with newspapers rolled up in their hands, and old women could be seen staggering as they were led by several big dogs. Wild cats, attracted by the smell of hot vegetable oil bread, were crouching under the iron railings next to the apartments, looking pitifully at each other. This was a city full of the smell of power. The rental of the apartments on the 13th Avenue was extremely high. Most of the residents were government workers in the Federation, or executives of large companies. Only these people would not care about the large amount of tax they had to pay to the HTD Bureau every year to raise pets. In recent years, the high-class prostitutes of the Federation had also begun to move into the 13th Avenue. They knew that the security and environment here, as well as the big shots living here, could provide them with a steady stream of customers. Su Le walked up from the underground parking lot at the end of the street. Feeling that the weather was a little hot, He took off his jacket and wrapped it around his arm. Although he still retained his military position as a civilian second lieutenant, he was already in the Whitewater Company, so he did not need to wear a military uniform every day. He silently walked past the high-class apartment buildings that towered into the clouds. Suddenly, he laughed. He thought of last year outside the nightclub in Linhai. Qinghai mocked Zhou for using perfume that only high-class prostitutes of the 13 Great Paths would use. He didn't expect that the days would not pass quickly. The man and woman, who seemed to be irreconcilable, would have a child because of one night of madness. Looking at the number plate of the high-class apartment building, Sula confirmed that it was number 187. He walked in, gave the security guard a temporary pass number, and was politely led to the elevator door by the gray-haired butler. The elevator door opened, and a waiter led Sula to the corridor on the right. The more they walked, the more silent Sula became. He realized that the top 3 floors of the high-class apartment building had been completely opened up. The side of the corridor was quiet, and the dome above his head was made of transparent tempered glass. He did not know how much such a renovation would have cost. At the end of the corridor was a small room. The green wallpaper filled the entire space, and there was an oil painting on the wall. It was a dazzling golden sunflower. Opposite the oil painting was a glass window, and the window sill was densely packed with green plants. The flowers between the plants were blooming. All that entered his eyes were flowers, and at a glance, there were flowers everywhere. However, these bright and colorful flowers did not make it difficult for people to feel annoyed. Instead, they only felt that the colors were bright, and it made people feel refreshed. Just like in the bedroom in the ivy garden, Li Xiaotong was always surrounded by flowers. It seemed that only in this way could the 7th young master of the Li family convince himself that he was just a playboy. The first thing Su Lu saw was not Li Xiaotong, who stood like a plum blossom, but the silent middle-aged bodyguard behind Li Xiaotong, Brother Zheng. Brother Zheng was standing behind Li Xiaotong's chair with his hands behind his back. He looked like a gun tightly bound with countless layers of coarse cloth. The cold light was restrained, and the murderous intent was not released. Li Xiaotong saw Su Lu come in, smiled, stood up, and reached out his hand. "I am very surprised that you can come, but I am also very happy." Su Lu clumsily reached out and shook hands with him. He had seen a lot of big shots and visited a lot of high-class places over the years. His heart had been shocked by the picturesque landscape of Macho's back mountain, so he shouldn't have been shocked by Li Xiaotong's 3-story building. However, he was still a nobody in his bones. Besides, coming here today was the first time that he was talking to the big shots of the Federation as an equal. Therefore, he was not used to it. During the night visit to the Ivy Garden, Sula did not cut off Li Xiaotong's head with the knife in his hand. On one hand, he knew that Park Ji-ho was not sent by the 7th young master of the Li family. On the other hand, the silent Brother Zheng was too strong. After that night's conversation, Li Xiaotong helped him hide the news of Park Ji-ho's death for a while. Although he did not do much, he still helped Su Lu. This morning, on the road in the suburbs, Su Lu received a call from this person. He had been thinking for a whole day before he decided to come to the banquet. But he did not understand why the other party wanted to meet him. Logically speaking, everyone thought that he had lost the fight for the laboratory data, so he should not have any value that could be used. Su Lu believed in the Tai family's confidentiality. Even the young master of the Li family could not know that he still had the key data. As for what Li Xiaotong said on the phone about following him, Su Lu could not even laugh. The richest family in the 7 families of the Federation was the Li family. According to Zhou Yu, although Li Xiaotong was ranked 7th in this generation, he was actually the second-in-line successor. Why would such a person follow him? This was too ridiculous to be a joke. In fact, after Su Lu walked into the room, the 7th young master of the Li family seemed to have forgotten what he said on the phone. He just gently chatted with him and introduced the oil painting of flowers and trees in the room. Lin Banshan once said that the old men in the Federation are already rotten. They like to do things in the company of tea, in the heat of hot springs, and ponder with each other for 10 or 20 years before revealing their true thoughts. The dishes were already on the table. The aroma was not very strong, but the taste seemed to be very good. Maybe they did not want the aroma of the dishes to mix with the fragrance of the flowers in the room. These young masters were always so picky when it came to details. Su Le drank a mouthful of water and listened to Li Xiaotong with narrowed eyes. He had heard the name Lin Banshan many times. He only knew that this person was different from the rest of the Lin family. The Lin Yuan that Su Le had been to twice was his property. What made him feel a little strange was that when Li Xiaotong and Zhou Yu mentioned Lin Banshan's name, they would show a certain degree of respect and a little strange emotion. My eldest brother has no one in his eyes, only Lin Banshan. Li Xiaotong cut the vegetables on his plate. He lowered his head slightly, but the sincere smile on his face did not make the trace of malice disappear completely. He even looked down on your friend, the young master of the Tai family. Although I have always thought that my eldest brother has a good appearance, I have to admit that he is vigilant and respectful towards Lin Banshan. I am the same. Su Le knew what kind of person Lin Banshan was, but at least he did not need to know at this time. Lin Banshan said that when you open the door, you have to see the mountain. When you see the mountain, you are the mountain. You can stand still and let wind blow from all directions. Li Xiaotong put down his knife and fork, looked at Su Le across the table and said, "So I will get straight to the point. I don't care what problems there are between the family, you, and the lady behind you. I want to establish some kind of personal friendship with you. This is why I asked you to come here today." That night in the Ivy Garden, Li Xiaotong had expressed a similar intention to Su Le, but there was no time to say it more thoroughly. Hearing this, Su Le was startled. He looked down at the ordinary jacket on the chair beside him and could not understand the other's meaning. That night, Li Xiaotong had asked Su Le to introduce him to Tai Ziyuan at a suitable time, but Su Le believed that just this little bit of benefit was not enough for the other to formally meet him. "I think you should know that the data from the laboratory has already reached the Federal Academy of Science. Even if you want to ruin the plans of the young master of the Li family, I am of no use." Su Le replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. Until today, he felt like he was on the terrace of Macho's back mountain. He was really not used to this kind of atmosphere. Since the other party was willing to get straight to the point, he had no reason to hesitate. If it was said that Great Secretary Shen was willing to work with Su Le because of his relationship with Tai Ziyuan, and because he knew very well that Su Le held in his hands mecha data that could affect the presidential election, then what about Li Xiaotong? Su Le did not think that a small character like himself had any right to win the other's personal friendship. This is indeed a very regrettable matter. That elder brother of mine was persuaded by that old fox, Senator Macklin, and burrowed headlong into the presidential election. He thinks that this is a very delicious cake, but in my opinion, he is not doing his job properly. Li Xiaotong smiled, but the sinister look between his brows was still thick. "But that night, I told you that I don't care at all about the presidential election. No matter how the president of the Federation changes, the 7 major families are still the same 7 major families. This is something that history has long since proven. But I am still the type of person that your family doesn't like," said Su Le. "As long as I like it." Li Xiaotong sipped the champagne in his glass and said slowly, "Our Li family has always been doing business. That elder brother of mine has been doing well these past few years, and the old men in the family all like him very much. They actually allowed him to cross the line, but they don't know that the deeper you cross the line, the greater the risk. I don't want to do that. Doing business is for the sake of making money, why bother with those things?" Su Le felt that Li Xiaotong was about to get to the point. "I am not Li Shizhu. I am a businessman, and I only do what a businessman should do." Li Xiaotong stared into his eyes and said, "I want to invest in you. I don't know what potential value I have that is worth the investment of the 7th young master of the Li family. You underestimate yourself." Li Xiaotong looked at him quietly and said, "Without data, you still have this person who can easily break through the defense of the Ivy Garden and the 3 layers of scanning of the Research Institute. I can't let such an unfathomable guy go so easily. Of course, I definitely won't invest in you as an assassin. Brother Zeng still stood calmly and silently behind Li Xiaotong. Just from this, Su Le knew that Li Xiaotong was not an ordinary person. The powerful bodyguard that the family had sent to his side was unexpectedly not guarded against. This showed that this person's ability was extraordinary. Perhaps this is a gamble, but I'm willing to take it. Li Xiaotong continued, I think even Lady Tai is willing to meet him in person. If I bet on him, even if I lose, I won't lose too much. Su Le was slightly startled. He didn't expect that what gave Li Xiaotong confidence was the meeting at the back mountain of Macho the day before. With an elder leading the way, if I don't know how to follow him to get a bowl of soup to eat, then I don't deserve to be a businessman. Of course there is a risk in investing, but it is precisely this kind of risk that brings benefits. You don't know that Lady Tai rarely sees people, but I am willing to bet on you not only because of this, but also because of what you have shown in this matter. Li Xiaotong suddenly laughed. The Federation is a place with rules. Whether it is the old men in my family, the lady of the Tai family, or even Commander Zhong in the West Woods, they all have to follow certain rules to do things, but you are different. Li Xiaotong narrowed his eyes and stared at his face with great seriousness. He said, there is something about you that doesn't stick to one pattern. Those unreasonable axes of yours actually made my elder brother and those hypocrites at the Academy of Science look so pathetic. In this world where rules must be followed, you don't follow the rules. This is why you are destined to either die an extremely miserable death in the future, or you will fight for a completely different future. The last person in this circle who didn't follow the rules like this was Lin Banshan. No matter how arrogant that little madman of the Li family is, there is still the old man who can firmly suppress him. Other than Lin Banshan and you, I can't see anyone else in this circle who can't find something above their heads that can suppress you. I also have to follow the rules, so even though I know that Park Ji-ho jumped into the arms of my big brother, I can't do anything about it. He also saw this point, so he was so presumptuous. Speaking of which, I have to thank you for helping me kill him. Li Xiaotong's tone became indifferent. But the problem now is that if I also follow the rules, this family will never be mine, so I have to invest in a person who doesn't follow the rules at all. A few days ago, I didn't make up my mind. Li Xiaotong's cold and stubborn face, like a plum blossom, showed a trace of a sad expression. But your unreasonable axes in the lab really hit my weak point. The lethality of this kind of resentful expression was really too great. If Shi Qinghai showed this kind of expression, it would probably be a bit tempting. If the beautiful young master of the Li family, Li Xiuzhu, showed this kind of expression, it would probably be a bit charming. Only Li Xiaotong was gloomy, surrounded by flowers, but he sighed faintly. It couldn't help but be like a pine tree that was pressed down by snow suddenly became delicate like a flower in a greenhouse, making people feel helpless. In Zhou Yu's words, Su Le was an outsider who didn't even understand what was going on, so he was completely unreasonable and ignorant. In terms of mechanics, he was talented, in terms of recognizing people, and in terms of calmness, he was talented, but in the end, he was still a stubborn stone that had not been polished. He was stubborn, but he was slightly clumsy, and he didn't understand a lot of things. After staying silent at the table for a long time, Su Le used the mind of an engineer to carefully arrange the things needed in his plan, and then he found that no matter whether what the young master of the Li family said was true or not, it seemed that he really didn't have anything that he couldn't lose in this federation. So he grinned and said seriously, I need a lot of money. In the suburbs of the southwest corner of the capital special district, several highways converged here, and then extended to the various states of the Federation planet S1. It was 9 o'clock at night and the highways were brightly lit, but there were not many cars driving. On the contrary, behind a mountain next to the highway, there was a road without street lights on both sides, but it was very lively and noisy. Countless famous brand sports cars gathered here, and the modified headlights emitted dazzling light, illuminating the usually quiet and almost abandoned road. A motorcade of 4 cars got off the highway out of the city and went around the hill. The scene of horns on both sides of the road became much quieter because of the arrival of the motorcade. Countless pairs of eyes looked over, and many people recognized the blue Silver Wraith. The Silver Wraith was the most expensive sports car in the Federation, but this Silver Wraith was not silver, and it was even more famous on the side of the hill road. Not everyone knew that this Silver Wraith belonged to the second heir of the Lee family, but everyone knew that the owner of this car had a cold temperament, and was an extremely big shot that was not to be trifled with. Their attention was attracted by the Silver Wraith, and not many people noticed the unmarked, ordinary-looking black car in the convoy. The motorcade drove to the end of the mountain road, and then it slowly came to a stop on the extremely quiet high ground. Li Xiaotong and Su Le got out of their cars and looked at the lively scene on the road not far from their feet. Their bodyguard, Brother Zheng, stood behind them indifferently. It was not appropriate to describe Su Le and Li Xiaotong at this time, as each of them had ulterior motives. Su Le did not have the ability to scheme in front of these children of aristocratic families, and for a big shot like the seventh young master of the Li family to condescend to associate with Su Le, he naturally had some ulterior motives, but the ulterior motive was still far away, not in the immediate interests. Since Li Xiaotong decided to establish a personal friendship with this young second lieutenant, they naturally needed to get along and see each other's temperament. A meal was far from enough, so he took Su Le to the western suburbs of the capital, the paradise of the reckless racing gang. I know that your girlfriend has been dead for half a year. Li Xiaotong glanced at Su Le next to him and said calmly, I have a lot of properties in the 13 great roads, and those high-class prostitutes have to give in to me. But you are not willing to accept, so I have to take you here to see. Su Le was silent. He did not know if Li Xiaotong had any deep meaning when he mentioned Zhang Xiaoming's death. He had never forgotten the life and death separation hidden behind the political dark of the Federation. He had forcibly seized the data left by Professor Shen. At this time, he stood with the seventh young master of the Li family. On one hand, he wanted to fight for the honor that Professor Shen deserved, and on the other hand, he wanted to make arrangements for his own plan. What was strange was that although the Li family's seventh young master was so rich that he could kill people, he didn't have too many displeasing behaviors. Su Le gradually understood the so-called aristocratic family's younger generation. The richer and more powerful they were, the more low-key they would be. However, what made him feel a little strange was that Li Xiaotong, who was gloomy and indifferent, was extremely careful with his tone of voice when talking to him. In this regard, Li Xiaotong was even better than Tai Ziyuan. He did not reveal a trace of a natural sense of superiority. This was something that should be hidden in the bones of the children of the aristocratic families, but Li Xiaotong was able to hide it so well. Su Le thought silently. He was afraid that Li Xiuzhu, the true successor, would really have to be careful. Su Le had been silent, but Li Xiaotong did not have any opinion. He pointed to the sports cars on the road and said with a smile, when I first met you at the entrance of Qingshan Park, I knew that you didn't like the way the rich people race cars. They don't care about human lives. But it's different here. This was originally the Shoujing Expressway. Later, a new road was built, and the old road was abandoned. There have always been very few cars and pedestrians passing by here. Moreover, the guys who race cars are all professionals, so they are very safe. I'm not interested in racing. Su Le shook his head. Is that so? That day on the number 2 expressway, you chased me and Zhou until we were in a bit of a mess. Li Xiaotong smiled and said, of course, you are now used to driving the Crown Prince's special car. Looking at these so-called brand-name sports cars, it's natural that you don't like them. Su Le shook his head again. He noticed that there was a temporary makeshift house on the side of the road. There was a faint blue light from a computer screen in the makeshift house. After thinking for a while, he guessed what was going on there. He said with a hint of surprise, gambling is so professional. Don't underestimate the gambling here. 12 years ago, Lin Banshan started his business here. Li Xiaotong's expression calmed down. When he mentioned that person's name, he couldn't help but have a trace of fascination. He said slowly, back then, the Lin family was like our Li family now. Several of their children were very outstanding. In order to compete for the recognition of the previous generation, they were very busy. Lin Banshan was the youngest in their generation, but he was also the most promising one. He suddenly shook his head and exclaimed, "As a result, on my 18th birthday, Lin Banshan sneered in front of all the guests and family elders in the courtyard and said, 'I'm too lazy to accept this kind of family business.' After saying this, he ate a piece of cake, kowtowed to his parents 3 times, and left the Lin family without looking back." Hearing this story, Sulu couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Lin Banshan was proud but not stupid. It was just that at that time, he was too rebellious in his bones. Seeing his brothers frowning every day, he felt disdain. He didn't want this family business, so he left in a carefree manner. He wanted to fight for his own country. After leaving the Lin family, Lin Banshan's first stop was here. At that time, the capital New Expressway had just opened. He opened a casino here, gambling on racing. In less than half a year, he made his first pot of gold. Then, he used the money to buy the hostel-like restaurant in HTD Bureau, which is now Linyuan. Linyuan? Sulu knew that Linyuan was Lin Banshan's business, but he didn't expect that many years ago, Lin Banshan, who had vaguely become a legend, could actually buy that piece of land with the income from illegal racing. So, don't underestimate the income here. Li Xiaotong said calmly, "We are all children of aristocratic families, and we all know how rich the family business is." Lin Banshan said he didn't want it and left in a carefree and arrogant manner. "I grew up with a golden spoon in my mouth, but I don't have his courage. I feel ashamed just thinking about it." The 7 families of the Federation were not ordinary families, and they were not ordinary businesses. Even if they failed to fight for the right of inheritance and stayed at home, they could enjoy a lifetime of wealth and privileges that the citizens of the Federation could not imagine. But Lin Banshan left at the age of 18, leaving behind words of disdain, and left in such an arrogant manner. This universe, this Federation, is made up of countless rules. The mysterious Lady Tai, the powerful president, and the noble army god still have to take care of the interests of all sides, constantly compromise and strive to find a balance between those lines. Li Xiaotong said indifferently, "Lin Banshan broke the rules, and I think one day, maybe you can break it too. I'm not a member of this circle." "For me, there are naturally no rules," Sulu replied. The modified sports car roared loudly. The car owners who were fussy about speed were naturally unwilling to use electric power or hybrid power, and the pungent smell of strong gasoline gradually filled the road. On the road at the foot of the mountain, a curvaceous girl was waving a flag, leading the car onto the track. From time to time, a wrecked car would be dragged back by a heavy-duty tractor. There were ambulances on standby at the bottom of the road. Everything seemed to be in order, but the cursing and whistling all around revealed the darkness and danger hidden in this place. Sulu calmly watched the scene unfold on the mountain. He did not pay attention to the winning or losing of these sports cars, but he was thinking about the person called Lin Banshan and the reason why the 7th young master of the Li family brought him here. According to Li Xiaotong, Lin Banshan had not returned to this hill for many years, and the casino here had long been transferred to someone else. But the rules set by this person 12 years ago were still there, and no one dared to make any changes, and no one dared to violate these rules. He had not returned for many years, but his influence was still so strong. It had to be said that the traitor of the Lin family was a very bad person. "Do you want to play a little bet?" Li Xiaotong looked at the silent Sulu, and felt more and more that his investment was very good. He had never seen a young man who could be so calm in a place like this where hormones were at their peak. If the Federation was full of people like Sulu, then no matter how arrogant Lin Banshan was, he would not have been able to make much money. "If I had money, I would not ask you for money," Sulu said with a smile, but his eyes narrowed. He found that in the waiting sports car on the road below, there was a figure that he felt was familiar. Investment is one thing. The room we ate in today, just the decoration and the few broken paintings cost me more than 4 million. The money you want will naturally be transferred to your account tomorrow. It will be transferred to the account you set up for me, Sulu corrected. Li Xiaotong smiled slightly, and the hem of his black coat swayed slowly in the night wind. He said, in addition to investment, it is also okay for friends to exchange what they need. You are not in a convenient situation, so I can lend you some money to make a small bet. It is not a bad idea. I don't borrow money. If I borrow money and return it, I will owe you a favor. Like you said, this is not the same as investment. Damn you. Li Xiaotong did not know if it was because he was used to acting gloomy in front of his brother and family elders. Even if he was angry and laughing at this time, there was still a sense of gloominess. He laughed and scolded, "Can you take it as a gift? Why do I have to bet?" Su Le looked at him curiously. Li Xiaotong calmly replied, "People who do business are very superstitious. I also pay attention to luck. If there is no accident, you are probably the riskiest and biggest investment I have made in my life. Tonight, I am here to try my luck and hope for a good start. If I lose the bet, you will continue to invest in me." Su Le smiled and said, "Then what is the point of us betting on cars? What if I win?" At this time, a group of people near the hills suddenly became noisy. It seemed that they had made a big bet and were very confident, so those young masters were shouting something loudly. Just as Li Xiaotong said, there were rules everywhere in the Federation. Both sides of the road were crowded with excited people, but there were not many people on the hill. Only people with status could come here. It is the son of the deputy chairman. He does not know who I am, and we have not talked before. Li Xiaotong glanced over and said to Su Lu. The deputy chairman of the Federation Management Committee was undoubtedly one of the most powerful people. Even Li Xiaotong was not willing to provoke his idiotic son. Su Lu glanced over and immediately withdrew his gaze. The white sports car down there is his. I heard that the driver is a professional driver specially invited from S3. The bonus one is not that much because the odds are so low. After all, this is an off-road race. No one dares to hope to win against a professional driver. Li Xiaotong pointed at the few cars on the road and said, "This kind of game is actually very unruly, but no one is willing to care about him, so they can only lower the odds. Look at the cars next to that one. They are not famous in the circle." Obviously, the owner is giving face to the deputy chairman's son and letting him have a good time. All these years, under the suppression of his dazzling elder brother, the seventh young master of the Li family had been pretending to be a ruthless playboy, playing with beautiful women on various planets of the Federation. He was very clear about these matters. "Lend me $1 million. Su Le narrowed his eyes, looked at the road, and suddenly said, "Lend, not give. Giving is a favor. I will return it to you. Legends don't appear every day in this place. Gambling like yours will really make you lose a lot." Li Xiaotong did not care about $1 million. He simply followed Su Li's eyes and found that the man next to him was staring at a race car. "No matter how it is modified, that race car will always lose," Li Xiaotong said. "Even if Lin Banshan drove it himself 12 years ago, it would still lose. Gambling is bound to lose, just like when you invested in me." Su Le looked at the inconspicuous race car and the man next to the car who looked like a delicate woman. He narrowed his eyes and said, "The risk of $1 million is not as great as the risk of you betting on me. That makes sense. I always thought that you were too calm and silent. You are young, but you are old and rusty. It is rare for you to go crazy. Of course, I have to take a look." Li Xiaotong laughed and asked his men to place their bets. Su Le looked at the delicate man next to the race car. His expression was calm, but he was thinking about something else. He was not a gambler. He was curious about the famous Lin Banshan, but he was not interested in betting on this kind of racing. He was only interested in the delicate man. After all, he would be spending time with the delicate man in the future. He wanted to know what kind of person he was. Not many people cared about this race. The odds were too different. The winner had been decided long ago. Very few people placed bets. Except for the chairman's son on the hill who threw in hundreds of thousands of dollars out of boredom, there were basically no bets. Suddenly, on the light screen outside the makeshift room, there was an additional 1 million, which immediately caused a commotion in the room. According to the current odds, if the race car won, the chairman's son would have to fork out 7 million. Such a big bet was rare, even when Lin Banshan was personally holding the line. The crowd on the other side of the hill cast strange glances at Li Xiaotong and Su Lu. There were not many people who could spend a lot of money to buy a quick profit. Only these two groups of people on the hill had the ability to do so. However, the people on the other side did not expect that their professional racer would lose. The deputy chairman's son even thought that this group of people deliberately lost a lot of money to him in order to make friends with him. More than 10 minutes later, everyone saw a very shocking scene. The race car, which seemed like it would fall apart at any time, slowly came back. Its speed was as slow as the broken carriage pulled by an old cow in ancient fairy tales. But the problem was that there was no other sports car behind the race car. Even the famous sports car driven by the professional racer was nowhere to be seen. Near the turning point in the distance of the old Shoujing Expressway, flames could be vaguely seen. No one knew what happened, but the heavy trailer and ambulance rushed away. There was a dead silence on both sides of the road. It was not until the delicate man climbed out of the race car that there was a burst of ear-piercing screams and cheers. Li Xiaotong indifferently looked at the bustling scene on the road. He looked at the delicate driver and slowly turned his head to look at Su Lu. He said, "Looks like we found another guy who doesn't follow the rules tonight." He had layers of doubts in his heart. How did Su Lu know that the race car was a crazy guy who was not afraid of death, and was not afraid of killing people? The racer was so delicate, as gentle and calm as a virgin. There are many unreasonable things in the Federation, but there are also many coincidences. Su Lu looked at the delicate man who was walking up the hill. He lowered his head and said, "Maybe you don't believe it, but I just saw this person today. He is my secretary." How much money a racer could get all depended on how much he bet on himself. Only then could he get a bonus. The White Magnolia needed money, so he had come here tonight to gamble with his life. However, if he hadn't placed a bet of 1 million, even if he had risked his life, he would only be able to get $110,000 from the son of the chairman. So he went up the hill personally to thank the person who had given him a lot of money. This had nothing to do with courtesy. He only respected people who could give him money. So when Bai Yulan saw that the person who had helped him earn a lot of money was actually the young technical director he had met today, his expression became a little strange. But he did not say anything. He said thank you to Su Lu and left the hill. This kind of desperate driving method, not to hurt others, but to hurt oneself first. It hasn't happened for a long time. Li Xiaotong looked at the delicate figure on the hill and reminded Su Lu, this kind of unruly driving method is very easy to get into trouble. Do you want to send some people to take him home? Su Lu did not say anything. He just thought about the delicate hands holding the folder. It was these delicate hands that drove the Cedo so crazily. It was these delicate hands that forced the professional racer into a dead end. A person with such a pair of hands would not die so easily. Li Xiaotong walked to the son of the chairman. Even if it was the son of the deputy speaker of the Federation, losing 7 million all of a sudden, his expression became extremely ugly or embarrassed. However, it was unknown what the seventh young master of the Li family said, but the speaker's son returned to his usual arrogance and nodded lightly. "I will transfer the money that this prodigal lost to you." Li Xiaotong walked back to Su Lu. Looking at the chaos at the foot of the hill, he said, "It seems that my investment will be very good." After that night, Su Li's life returned to a dull and boring state. He lived in the apartment in Wangdu every day, worked in the farm-like headquarters of the Whitewater Company in the commercial district, and occasionally talked to Zhou Yu on the phone or had a meal with Li Xiaotong. He looked at the faces of the small stars in the Federation in front of money and wealth. It was more or less the same as before, but there were some differences. He met with Zhou Yu a few times and passed a part of the data model to him. However, he kept the direct results of his and Professor Shen's research. Li Xiaotong's large sum of money had already been transferred to his account. Su Lu began to buy the equipment and components he needed through the black market like an ant moving house. Su didn't know how the Federal Academy of Sciences project was progressing. He also didn't know what influence Secretary Shen had on the Nutshell Engineering Department. He didn't even know the details of the engineering department's research on the new generation of the Federation's mecha, but he asked the other party to give him data feedback. The resources that needed to be prepared were prepared. The total data that needed to be obtained was also in his hands. The only thing that needed to be done was the failed prototype MX in the Whitewater Company. His secretary, Bai Yulan, came to his office to report once a day and then couldn't find him again. This delicate man's attitude towards Su didn't change at all because of the bet that night. He was still as gentle as ever, but he was still as cold as ever. Just like that, 10 days passed. Su felt extremely tired. At this moment, he couldn't help but think of Shi Qinghai. He thought of the days when he and Mr. Shi worked together to fight against the Federation Investigation Bureau. The Federal Academy of Science and the Nutshell Engineering Department were in a secret competition. However, even though he had the core data, he couldn't do anything about it. He didn't even completely trust the Tai family, let alone Li Xiaotong. Secretary Bai was also cold to him. He didn't have a single partner by his side. This kind of pressure was too great. Shi Qinghai smiled as he looked at the surveillance camera on the door. His hands were behind his back, holding the Taiping axe that he had picked up in the corridor earlier. Then he swung the axe down. He completely ignored the apartment's complete surveillance and alarm system and smashed the door open. The alarm didn't sound. Shi Qinghai kicked the person behind the door to the ground. After closing the door, he dragged the axe and walked towards the person on the ground. The temperature in the apartment was extremely low. In this late spring and early summer, the owner of the apartment was still wearing a fitted synthetic sweater. Shi Qinghai didn't say a word to the man whose eyes were flickering. He swung the axe down and chopped off the man's right hand. Blood spurted out, and the man screamed in pain. Shi Qinghai exhaled softly. His handsome face was full of satisfaction. He praised, "You made me so hard to find." Chapter 203. After all, the blood in a human body was not the same as the water stored in a fire engine. After gushing out from the severed wrist, the blood was depleted in an instant, dripping and soaking the synthetic blanket in front of the sofa. The blanket was full of blood, and its color became extremely dark and heavy. However, the smell of blood was not absorbed, and instead, it began to spread around the room. The middle-aged man in the synthetic sweater was called Wang Xian, a very ordinary name, and a very ordinary person. At this time, he had lost an arm, and his face was pale. However, after the scream, he stubbornly pursed his lips and did not say a word. He used his left hand to press down on the joint of his right arm. He did not want to die from excessive blood loss, and he also did not think that this beautiful man in front of him would kill him immediately. People who did this kind of work were always extremely careful. The way they died was usually through betrayal or being silenced by their superiors. It was very rare for an enemy to come directly to their door and cut off their arm in such a violent scene. Wang Xian raised his head and looked at the beautiful man in front of him with resentful eyes. He did not ask how the other party found his place, although this was his biggest curiosity. He only forced himself to be calm and said, "What do you want?" The simple surveillance system and alarm system outside the apartment did not have the slightest reaction when the other party broke in. It seemed that the other party had already cleaned the surroundings of the apartment in advance. Although Wang Xian was only an intelligence officer, his ability to protect himself was not bad. However, in front of the other party, he could not even block a single kick, and he could not avoid that tyrannical axe. Combining these two situations, he knew how terrifying the enemy was today. More importantly, he recognized the real identity of this beautiful man at a glance. He began to feel fear and despair, but the other party did not immediately kill him, and he smelled a trace of opportunity. Shi Qinghai took out a pack of 37 brand cigarettes from his pocket, lit one, and took a deep breath. He crouched beside the pool of blood and took a wallet from Wang Xian's body. Through the phone of Senator Macklin's secretary, Helen, he obtained some information, but the information was too vague and too jumbled. It took him a full 3 days to sort through the information before he found the person in front of him named Wang Xian. This person was nominally a staff member of the S2 Mountain Ring 4 States Peace Foundation, but the number of times he appeared in Helen's phone seemed to be a little too much. Starting from this point of suspicion, he began to secretly investigate Wang Xian, paying special attention to this person's movements before the 1st of January of the 67th year of the constitutional calendar. He graduated from the 1st Military Academy with the highest grades, and was one of the most successful anti-government army spies in the Federation. No matter how well Wang Xian's cover, he still found many problems. "You should know me." While rummaging through his wallet, Shi Qinghai said vaguely with a cigarette in his mouth, "So, you should know very well that I'm here for revenge. It'll be very difficult for you to survive. But before you die, I'd like to know one thing. How did Senator Macklin send the information to Yang Jingsong of the Department of Defense when he learned that the source of danger was going to Linhai State Stadium?" Some of the ashes flew down with the slight movement of his lips, landing on the dark and bloody carpet. He continued calmly, "I've been investigating for a long time, and Macklin did indeed talk to Yang Jingsong on the phone. But with Yang Jingsong's enmity towards the comrades in the mountains, he shouldn't believe it so easily. So there must be another group of people who vouched for him." Shi Qinghai smiled slightly, and a kind expression appeared on his delicate face. "Tell me who that group of people is. Also, I believe that you must have some evidence that can embarrass Senator Macklin. Please give it to me as well." The other party was a military officer. "I don't know who's behind him, but there was one time when I found out that it seemed to be a big shot in Parliament Mountain. At first, I thought it was someone from the 7 great families, but after some analysis, I don't think so." Wang Xian leaned on the sofa, his eyes staring blankly at the blood dripping from his wrist. Without any hesitation, he confessed according to Shi Qinghai's request. He used to be a member of the organization, so he was very clear about the severity of the organization's punishment for traitors. Although this beautiful man in front of him seemed to have left the organization and become a wandering ghost, since he was able to become the organization's most successful spy in the capital ring of the Federation, the other party must have more tricks up his sleeve. He knew that he couldn't survive those tricks, and there was no loss for him and Senator Macklin to betray their partner. Did the military officer have any special characteristics? A standard professional soldier in the Federation. He used a military encrypted phone. I tried to eavesdrop on him a few times, but I failed. I couldn't follow him either. Wang Xian panted. What I want are the real characteristics. He was wearing a wig. His real hair should be maroon red. Maroon red hair was indeed rare in the Federation, but there were at least a few million people in the population of tens of billions. After a moment of silence, Shi Qinghai said, "Looks like you're quite meticulous. That's all for this clue. Next up is the second one. I need something that can make Senator Macklin uncomfortable." This was the third time Shi Qinghai had mentioned the word comrade. A strange expression appeared on Wang Xian's pale face. He panted and said, "I only asked you to give me a quick death. You know very well that I can't fulfill this request of yours." Shi Qinghai threw the wallet on the floor and took out a photo. It was a photo of Wang Xian, his wife, and daughter. He put the photo in front of Wang Xian's eyes and didn't say a word. He just waited for the other party's answer. Wang Xian bit his lip and didn't say a word. He knew that the other party was using his family's life to threaten him, but he still didn't say anything. Shi Qinghai frowned and looked at the photo carefully. Suddenly, he tore open a corner of the photo with 2 nimble fingers. It turned out that the photo was actually double-layered. After tearing open the top layer, he could see another photo underneath. Wang Xian's originally extremely pale complexion became even uglier at this time. The photo underneath was also a family photo, but the woman and child in it were different from the first photo. As a special agent, you made a fatal mistake. People like us don't have the right to expect love and family, not to mention having such a cute child. Shi Qinghai threw the photo on the floor beside Wang Xian. He picked up the axe and gently placed it on the photo. The sharp edge of the axe just happened to rest on the neck of the cute little girl in the photo. Even if you have a family, you should be more careful. What's the use of double-layered photos when you can't carry them around? This kind of artistic aura can really kill people. Don't implicate the wife and child. Wang Xian stared at Shi Qinghai with resentment. Don't forget the rules of the organization. Since the massacre 30 years ago, the organization has strictly prohibited the use of such violent means. If you dare to do so, the disciplinary committee won't let you go. Even, he will have to bear the pain and behead you. When you betrayed my teacher, did you think about the consequences? Shi Qinghai's expression was calm, but his voice was incomparably cold. I believe you didn't, so I won't think about the consequences. I don't belong to any organization. I'm just carrying out a very simple revenge. Wang Xian's expression was gloomy. He knew that he was going to die today, but he had to think about his daughter. He knew that the handsome man in front of him could be a terrifying killing machine when he turned cold. Half an hour later, Shi Qinghai tidied up everything in the apartment. He checked the recording pen and the transferred data on him one last time. He walked out of the room and closed the door that had been cut open by the axe. Next to the sofa behind the door, the already dead Wang Xian lay in a pool of blood with his eyes closed. Taking the subway to the old airport in the capital, Shi Qinghai silently walked to a stove in the corner while listening to the street music of street performers hitting empty cannon shells. The weather in the late spring had begun to become hot and dry. No one was willing to go near the stove. There were only some remnants of incense ashes used to worship the dead. It seemed that the Yulon festival had just passed away. Taking off his gloves and shoes, Shi Qinghai put them into the fire. He calmly looked at the suddenly rising flames, as if he saw his teacher's chubby, sometimes serious, sometimes cute face in the flames. Su Lu and Shi Qinghai had lost contact for a long time. He didn't know that Mr. Shi was getting closer to the truth of the matter step by step. He even had some evidence that Senator Macklin was involved in the assassination in Linhai State. The problem was that both of them were young people who walked the path of revenge alone. Even if they had evidence in their hands, they probably wouldn't know where to send it. The wife of the Tai family should have been the most angry person. However, in the context of the Great Reconciliation of the Federation, and the fact that Senator Macklin represented the collective will of the people in the 4 states around the mountains, the political figures in the Federation probably wouldn't want to take such a risk when the election was about to begin. The computer screen showed the number in the account. Seeing so much money under his control for the first time, even someone as calm as Su Lu couldn't help but feel a little lost for a moment. Until today, he still didn't fully understand why the 7th young master of the Li family was willing to invest in him. An eclectic axe? This statement was too idealistic and too artistic. It shouldn't be the temperament of a calm businessman. Secretary Bai Yulon walked in and took the Weapons Maintenance Fund application documents that required Su Li's signature. He walked out of the room. These days, this delicate man still kept a distance from Su Lu. Half a minute later, Bai Yulon suddenly returned to the office. He looked at Su Lu for a long time and said, "There are some problems in the armory. Do you want to go take a look after work? You're tuning into the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.